Hello everyone, I'm your storyteller. Thanks for choosing me. Your support motivates me for the best work. I know you're watching this to unwind and drift off to sleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's allow the darkness to take over. Leave all your worries behind and make yourself comfortable. And let's get started. It was late one summer evening when I first heard it. The sun had just begun its descent, painting the sky in strokes of amber and violet. I had wandered out to the edge of the woods near my home, drawn by the crisp coolness that only comes with twilight. The air felt alive, as if the world were holding its breath. That's when it happened. A faint melody drifted through the trees, soft and lilting, like a distant lullaby carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was the wind teasing the leaves, but this was different, more deliberate, almost human. My pulse quickened. Is someone singing out there? I murmured to myself, my voice barely above a whisper. I stood still, straining to catch the sound again. There it was, faint but distinct. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a kind of sorrow I couldn't quite place. The hair on my arms stood on end, not from fear, but from something deeper, an unshakable sense that this melody wasn't meant for me or anyone. Maybe it's someone camping by the river, I thought, trying to rationalize it. But deep down, I knew no one ventured out to the hidden river at this hour. The stories about it were enough to keep most people away. The hidden river had always been a place of quiet mystery in our little town. Nestled deep within the forest, it shimmered with an otherworldly glow under moonlight. The elders spoke of its beauty in hushed tones, warning that it wasn't just a river, it was alive, a keeper of secrets. My curiosity got the better of me. I'll just take a quick look, I said aloud, as if convincing myself. I stepped off the familiar trail and into the shadowy woods. The further I walked, the clearer the melody became, wrapping itself around me like a ghostly embrace. The forest grew darker, the trees arching overhead to form a tunnel that seemed to lead directly to the river. My footsteps crunched softly against the leaf-strewn ground, and I couldn't help but notice how the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had gone completely silent. Finally, I reached the riverbank. The hidden river was more breathtaking than I remembered. Its waters shimmered in the dim light, rippling with a silvery glow. But what held me captive wasn't the river itself, it was the sound. The melody was unmistakably coming from the river. It rose and fell like a sigh, weaving itself into the rhythm of the water. I knelt by the bank, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer came, but the melody shifted, becoming softer, almost inviting. It felt like the river was ... listening. I dipped my hand into the cool water, half expecting something to pull me in. Instead, a strange calm washed over me, as if the river was welcoming me into its secret world. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening. The melody wasn't just a sound, it was a story. I could feel it in my bones, a tale of love and loss, of voices long silenced by time. I thought of the legends, the stories of people who disappeared near the river, their names whispered only in folklore. Had they left behind echoes of themselves woven into this song? Suddenly, the melody faltered, and a single word seemed to rise above the water, carried by a voice so soft it could have been the wind. "Help!" My breath caught. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. But the river only answered with its song, now tinged with a sadness that made my chest ache. I don't remember how long I stayed by the river that night, but when I finally stood to leave, I felt changed, like I had glimpsed something beyond the veil of the ordinary. As I walked back home, the melody followed me, quieter now, like a whisper saying goodbye. That night, I dreamed of the river. In my dream, I was standing on its banks, surrounded by figures made of light. They weren't frightening, if anything, they seemed grateful. one by one. They faded into the water, leaving only the melody behind. When I awoke, the world felt softer, less heavy. The stresses of the day seemed smaller, inconsequential. I returned to the river many times after that night, but the melody never came back. Perhaps it had shared all it needed to, leaving me with a sense of peace I can't quite explain. Even now, when life feels overwhelming, I close my eyes and imagine that melody. It's as if the river left a part of itself with me. A quiet reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, beauty and solace can be found. And when the whispers of the hidden river come to mind, I fall asleep with ease, the weight of the day dissolving into its gentle song. The village of Silenwood was unlike any other place I had ever been. Nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by towering pines, it had an air of stillness that was both serene and unsettling. Life in Silenwood seemed to move at its own pace, slow and deliberate, as if time itself had forgotten to hurry. Yet, there was one rule that every villager followed without question. No one went near the hidden river at dusk. I had heard the stories growing up, whispered tales of shadows on the water, voices that called your name, and the haunting melody that could lure even the strongest minds into the depths. At first, I dismissed them as folklore, just another small-town superstition. But when I came to stay in Silenwood for a few months, I quickly realized that the fear was real, etched into the faces of those who lived there. It started with the way people spoke about the river, or rather, the way they avoided speaking about it. Mention the hidden river in casual conversation, and the room would fall silent, eyes darting nervously to the floor. Once I asked the baker, a kind woman named Marta, about it. She froze mid-motion, her hand trembling as she placed a loaf of bread in a paper bag. "Best not to ask too many questions," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but I couldn't let it go. Something about the river called to me. It wasn't just the stories, it was the way the air seemed to shift whenever dusk approached, as if the whole village held its breath. Even the animals seemed to sense it. The birds stopped singing, and the usual hum of crickets faded into an unnatural silence. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a walk to the edge of the village, just close enough to see the forest where the river began. I told myself I wouldn't go far, that I only wanted to understand why everyone was so afraid. As I approached the tree line, the air grew colder, though the day had been warm. There was a small path leading into the woods, overgrown and rarely used. It felt as though the trees were leaning in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. My footsteps were soft, but every snap of a twig beneath my boots sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stopped when I reached a clearing where the first faint shimmer of the river came into view. It was breathtaking, the water catching the last rays of sunlight and reflecting them like liquid silver. For a moment, I understood why the villagers once revered this place, calling it a gift from the heavens. But that sense of wonder was short-lived. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the river seemed to change. The shimmer turned darker, and a faint sound began to rise from the water. It was soft at first, almost like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, forming a melody that sent a chill down my spine. I can't explain it fully, but the sound wasn't just something I heard, it was something I felt. It tugged at my chest, a mix of longing and sadness so profound it was almost unbearable. I wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of the village, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, I heard it. A voice clear and gentle, like someone speaking from just beyond the trees. "Why are you here?" it asked, the words blending into the melody. My throat went dry, and I managed to stammer, I just wanted to see the river." The voice didn't answer, but the air grew heavier, pressing against my skin like a weight. The melody shifted, becoming darker, more mournful. Images began to flash in my mind, faces of people I didn't recognize. their expressions filled with pain and longing. I remembered the stories of those who had disappeared, and suddenly they didn't feel like stories anymore. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at the edge of the village. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, but the melody lingered, faint and distant, as if it had followed me. When I returned to my lodging, Marta was waiting for me on the porch. She didn't say a word, just looked at me with an expression that was equal parts anger and fear. "You went to the river," she finally said, her voice trembling. I nodded, too shaken to deny it. She sighed and sat down beside me. "You don't understand what you've done. The river, ... It remembers, it doesn't let go of those who hear its song." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she wouldn't say any more. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the melody still echoing in my mind. It wasn't until much later that I learned the truth that the river's whispers were the voices of those who had been lost to it. Souls trapped between worlds, longing for someone to hear their story. Even now, as I tell you this, I can still hear the faint hum of that melody in my memory. It's beautiful and haunting, a reminder of the power the hidden river holds. I never went back, but part of me wonders what might have happened if I had stayed just a little longer, if I had let the river tell me its secrets. It was a warm summer afternoon when I first met Clara, a little girl with bright eyes and a curiosity that could rival the sun. I had been staying in Silenwood for a few months by then, drawn to the quiet charm of the village and the unspoken mysteries that seemed to linger in the air. Clara lived in the house next to mine, a bundle of energy and questions, always asking about the books I read or the drawings I made. But what set her apart was her fascination with the hidden river. Unlike the other children, who avoided even speaking its name, Clara was captivated by it. "Why do they say it's dangerous?" she asked me one day, her voice a mixture of innocence and defiance. "It's just a river, isn't it?" I hesitated. "How do you explain to a child the weight of centuries-old fears?" "It's not just a river," I said gently. "The villagers believe it holds ... secrets, things that aren't meant to be disturbed." Her brow furrowed as she pondered my words. "But secrets are just stories waiting to be told," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. That was Claire fearless, with a mind too curious for her own good. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air grew heavy with the scent of pine, Clara knocked on my door. She was clutching a small lantern, her face lit with excitement. "Come with me," she said, her voice urgent. "I want to show you something." "Clara," I began cautiously, "it's almost dusk. You know you shouldn't be out, but you'll see, it's beautiful," she insisted, tugging at my sleeve. Reluctantly, I followed her, my own curiosity outweighing the unease that had settled in my chest. She led me through the winding forest path, her tiny feet navigating the roots and stones with an ease that spoke of familiarity. The woods were quieter than usual. The chirping of birds were replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. When we reached the riverbank, the hidden river stretched before us, its waters glowing faintly in the fading light. Clara knelt by the edge, her lantern casting a soft halo around her. "Listen," she whispered. At first, I heard nothing but the gentle flow of water over rocks. But then, faint and melodic, came a voice. It wasn't loud or clear, more like a song carried on the breeze. It rose and fell, weaving through the air like a ribbon of sound. "Do you hear it?" Clara asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Where did you hear this first?" She pointed to the river. "It started a few nights ago. I couldn't sleep, so I came here. It was louder then, like it was calling me." "Clara," I said, my voice trembling, "you shouldn't be here alone. The river, ... it's not safe." "But it's not scary," she said, her tone almost scolding. "It's sad, like it's lonely." I stared at her, unsure of what to say. The melody grew louder, wrapping around us like a gentle embrace. It was beautiful, haunting and undeniably alive. Do you think it's a person? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I admitted. The villagers' warnings echoed in my mind, tales of lost souls trapped in the water, their voices woven into the current. But standing there with Clara, it felt different, less sinister, more sorrowful. Clara tilted her head, listening intently. It's saying something, she said. Can't you hear it? I strained to listen, and for a moment the melody seemed to shift, forming words that were just out of reach. We should go, I said finally, pulling Clara back from the edge. But it's not done yet. Clara, I said firmly, this isn't a game. We need to leave. Reluctantly, she followed me back to the path, glancing over her shoulder as the melody faded into the night. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice from the river echoed in my mind, a mixture of sadness and longing that I couldn't shake. Clara's words haunted me too. It's lonely. The next morning, I found Clara sitting on her porch, her usual brightness dimmed. Do you think it's sad because no one listens to it? She asked, not looking up. I think it's sad because it's trapped, I said quietly. For the first time, Clara seemed to understand the weight of the river's mystery. Maybe it just wants someone to care, she said softly. I never returned to the hidden river with Clara, and over time, her curiosity seemed to fade, replaced by other childhood adventures. But every so often, I'd catch her humming a tune that sounded eerily familiar. Even now, years later, I can still hear that melody in my dreams. It's as if the river left a piece of itself with us, a quiet reminder of its story waiting to be told. And on nights when the world feels heavy, I think of Clara, her fearless curiosity, and the gentle voice in the water, and I feel a strange sense of peace. The sun had just begun its descent behind the towering pines when I first met Elias, the old fisherman. He sat on the porch of the village's lone tavern, a pipe resting between his lips and a faraway look in his eyes, his hands calloused from decades of casting nets and hauling in the river's bounty, rested idly on his knees. I was drawn to him, as though he carried answers to questions I hadn't yet dared to ask. Thinking about the river, I asked, taking a seat on the wooden bench beside him. His eyes shifted to me, sharp and piercing despite his age. It's always the river, he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if the water had etched its mark on his soul. I had heard whispers about Elias since arriving in Splinwood. The villagers spoke of him with a mix of respect and caution. He was the only one who dared to fish the hidden river, even at dusk. Foolish was how some described him. Others called him brave. I wasn't sure which was true. They say you know its secrets, I ventured. Elias chuckled, a dry sound that carried no joy. Secrets. Aye. The river has plenty, but it doesn't give them up easily. You've got to earn them, and not everyone's willing to pay the price. The words hung heavy in the air, like the stillness before a storm. I hesitated, then asked, what price? He tapped his pipe against the edge of the bench, watching the embers scatter like fireflies. Have you ever listened to the river? He asked, his tone turning serious. Listened, I repeated. Not the way you hear the wind or the birds. I mean really listened. There's a voice in it, soft and mournful. Some call it a song, others a warning. But it's always there, beneath the surface. I shivered, remembering the faint melody I'd heard during my own visit to the river. What does it say? Elias leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. No one knows for sure. Some say it's the voices of those who've drowned, calling for help. Others believe it's the river itself, alive and yearning for something it's lost. But there's one tale, older than the village itself, that keeps me up at night. I leaned closer, caught in the gravity of his words. What tale? He took a long draw from his pipe before speaking. They say the river wasn't always like this. Long ago, it was a place of life and joy. People would gather on its banks to celebrate, to share stories and laughter. But there was one man, a fisherman, like me, who grew greedy. He believed the river owed him more, that its treasures were his to take. So he cast his nets deeper and deeper, pulling out not just fish, but stones, jewels, and relics buried beneath the water. Elias's voice dropped, and I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. The river grew angry. It said that one night, as the fisherman cast his net, the water rose up like a living thing, dragging him and his boat beneath the surface. When the villagers came to search for him, they found nothing, no boat, no body, not even a ripple to suggest he'd been there. From that day on, the river changed. Its waters darkened, and the song began. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. And you still fish there? Elias smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing something others don't. I respect the river, he said. I don't take more than it's willing to give. That's the difference between me and the fisherman in the tale. I listened. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The sun had nearly set, casting the sky in shades of amber and rose. I wanted to ask him more why he kept returning to the river, whether he'd ever heard the voice clearly, but something in his demeanor told me he'd said all he was willing to. As I stood to leave, Elias reached out and placed a hand on my arm. His grip was firm, his eyes intense. If you ever hear it calling your name, he said, don't answer. No matter how sweet the song, no matter how strong the pull, turn away. The river doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. As I walked back to my lodging, his words echoed in my mind. The river doesn't forget. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the river's dark waters, the mournful melody, and the old fisherman who dared to tread where others wouldn't. The wind outside my window carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like a lullaby sung from miles away. It wasn't until I drifted into a restless sleep that I realized the hum had the rhythm of the river's song. The first time I saw it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It had been a long day, and the sun was already setting as I made my way to the river. The villagers had warned me repeatedly to stay away, especially at dusk, but curiosity has a way of making you ignore even the loudest cautions. The hidden river was quieter than usual that evening, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. I could hear the soft ripple of water over stones and the faint hum of crickets starting their nightly song. As I stood on the bank, a soft breeze brushed past me, carrying the faint scent of moss and something else, something metallic, like the air before a storm. I knelt down to touch the water, curious about its strange stillness, when I saw it a glimmer just beneath the surface. It wasn't the sunlight reflecting off the water. No, the sun had already dipped too low for that. This was different, like a shimmer alive with movement, shifting and swirling in patterns too precise to be random. It pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. At first, I thought it might be fish, or maybe the light playing tricks on the riverbed. But as I leaned closer, the shimmer grew brighter, almost beckoning me to come closer. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just light. It felt alive, like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. Don't touch it. The voice startled me, making me stumble back onto the muddy bank. I turned to see an old woman standing a few feet away. Her face was lined with years of stories, her eyes sharp and clear despite her age. She carried a basket of herbs, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the handle. "Did you see it?" I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded solemnly. "I've seen it many times. That shimmer is older than this village, older than any of us. It's not meant to be touched." "What is it?" I pressed, feeling an odd mix of fear and fascination. The woman sat on a rock nearby, setting her basket down. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's the soul of the river. Others believe it's a guardian, watching over those who dare come too close. But everyone agrees on one thing: it's not something you want to disturb. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Has anyone ever tried? She looked at me, her expression grim. A long time ago, before the warnings became whispers in every child's ear, a man saw the shimmer and thought it was treasure. He was convinced it was gold or jewels lying just below the surface. He came back with a net, determined to claim it for himself. What happened to him? I asked, already dreading the answer. The river took him, she said simply, her voice low. One moment he was standing on the bank, and the next he was gone. The shimmer disappeared for weeks after that, as though it was morning. When it returned, it was quieter, more elusive. It hasn't taken anyone since, but no one's been foolish enough to tempt it again. Her words hung heavy in the air, and I found myself glancing back at the water. The shimmer was still there, but it seemed dimmer now, as though it knew we were talking about it. Why does it feel ... alive? I asked. The old woman sighed, her gaze distant. Because it is. The river is alive, just like the forest and the mountains. It remembers. It protects itself. I wanted to leave, to turn away from the river and never look back, but something about the shimmer held me captive. It wasn't just beautiful, it was sad. There was a loneliness to it, a longing that I couldn't quite put into words. You should go, the woman said, her voice breaking through my thoughts. The river doesn't like to be watched for too long. It'll start watching back. Reluctantly, I stood and took a step away from the bank. The shimmer flickered one last time, almost like it was saying goodbye. As I walked back to the village, the old woman's warning echoed in my mind. The river remembers. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the shimmer. It felt like a secret, one that the river was trying to share but couldn't quite put into words. I dreamed of it, of its gentle glow and the way it moved like it was alive. In my dream, the river spoke to me, its voice soft and mournful, but the words slipped away as soon as I woke. Even now, I wonder about the shimmer beneath the surface. Was it truly a guardian, or something else entirely? Whatever it was, it stayed with me, a quiet presence in my thoughts. And sometimes, when the world feels too loud and chaotic, I close my eyes and picture it, its gentle glow reminding me of the mysteries that still exist, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or spirits. I always thought of myself as a pragmatic person, someone who relied on reason and logic. But that changed the moment I arrived at the hidden river. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a break from the chaos of city life. Instead, it became something far more unsettling, something that still lingers in the back of my mind even now. It started the first night I spent in the small, weathered cabin by the river. The villagers had warned me about staying out too late, especially near the water. They spoke in hushed tones, their words coated with a kind of fear that seemed too real to ignore. But I, being the skeptic, dismissed it as mere superstition. The idea of voices in the river, echoes of the forgotten, as they called it, felt like something out of a folk tale. I was determined to enjoy my time here, to escape the noise of my everyday life. The night was quiet when I first heard it. I was sitting on the porch, watching the water as it shimmered under the light of the moon. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of air that wraps around you like a blanket. I leaned back in my chair, my feet up on the railing, letting the peacefulness wash over me. That's when it came, the faintest sound. So quiet, I thought it might have been the wind. At first I thought I imagined it, but then it came again, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice, it was distant, yet so clear, as if it were calling to me from far away. I stood up, looking out over the river, scanning the dark waters. The sound was like a whisper, but there was something more to it, a sense of urgency, a cry for help, perhaps. I walked to the edge of the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice seemed to beckon me, drawing me closer to the river. It was as if the water itself was speaking to me, sharing secrets of the past. "Hello," I called out, but the only answer was the faint ripple of the river. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down to the water's edge. The river was calm, almost too calm, and the air felt heavy with something I couldn't name. The voice came again, this time clearer, like a soft sigh carried on the wind. But there was no one around, no one but me and the river. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound calm. But the moment the words left my lips, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really. The voice didn't answer, but I could hear it still, echoing in the distance. It was a soft murmur, just beyond the reach of my senses. I could barely make out the words, but they seemed to be repeating something, over and over again. My name? "Come closer, ... Come closer, ... The voice seemed to say. A part of me knew I should leave. That old, sensible part of me whispered that this wasn't normal, that I should turn around and go back to the cabin. But curiosity, that persistent feeling that drives us to chase the unknown, pushed me forward. I stepped closer to the water, the beam of my flashlight flickering as if the darkness was swallowing it up. The voice grew louder, closer, as if something was just under the surface. I crouched down by the river's edge, shining my light into the dark water. For a moment, there was nothing, just the smooth black surface of the river, reflecting the moon like a mirror. Then I saw it, a shimmer beneath the surface. It was faint at first, like the ripples from a distant stone thrown into the water. But then it began to grow, and the voice became clearer, almost as if it was rising from the very depths of the river. "Come closer, ... Come closer, ... It whispered again, but this time it sounded like a plea. My heart raced. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to listen, to understand what it was trying to tell me. It wasn't fear anymore, it was a strange kind of sadness that filled the air around me, pulling me in. I knelt down, my fingers grazing the water's surface. That's when the voice changed. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a mournful cry. "Help me," it said, the words breaking through the silence like a plea for mercy. The water rippled violently, as if something was struggling beneath the surface. I jumped back, heart pounding, as the river seemed to come alive. The shimmer beneath the water turned into shapes that twisted and writhed, as if reaching for me. I could hear the voices now, dozens of them, all overlapping, calling out in a language I couldn't understand. Some were desperate, others were mournful, but all of them seemed to reach for someone. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was this? What was happening? The river's surface was still again, as if nothing had ever occurred. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices were still there, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting. I ran back to the cabin, my breath shallow, and locked the door behind me. I couldn't explain what I had heard or what I had seen. All I knew was that something had been calling out to me, something ancient and forgotten, lost to time but not to the river. That night, I could hardly sleep, the sound of those voices echoing in my mind, the feeling of being watched lingering in the room with me. The next morning, I woke up to the stillness of the river, the air heavy with the memories of the night before. I couldn't shake the sense of longing in those voices, the sadness in their call. As the days passed, I came to realize something. The hidden river had a history, a deep, dark past that no one spoke of openly. The villagers, the old stories, the whispers about the river's power, it all made sense now. The voices beneath the water weren't just echoes. They were memories, forgotten souls, trapped in the river's depths, forever reaching out to those who dare listen. Now, whenever I find myself near water, I can't help but listen, wondering if the river will call to me again. And every time, I hear that same faint whisper just beneath the surface, reminding me that some voices are never truly forgotten. They linger, waiting for someone to hear them, someone to remember. I had heard the tales before, of course. Every village I passed through told their own version of the story, the hidden river that whispered, the strange melody that danced on the breeze just after sunset. But I never gave much thought to the legends. I was a traveler, always moving from one place to the next, never staying long enough to become a part of the stories. That was until I stumbled upon the hidden river myself. I had been walking for hours, my boots sinking into the soft earth of the forest floor, my body weary from the day's journey. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I had no specific destination in mind. Sometimes I liked to get lost, to wander with no plans, letting the road lead me wherever it would. The idea of a hidden river had intrigued me when I heard it mentioned by a kindly innkeeper. But I didn't think much of it until I heard the sound. At first, it was faint, a soft, almost imperceptible tune drifting on the evening air. I paused. The sound was so pure, so beautiful, that it felt like something out of a dream. There were no words, no voices, just the delicate, haunting melody that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It wasn't like any music I had ever heard before, and yet it was familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. It felt ... timeless. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the music, but the forest was still. No one was in sight. The trees whispered their secrets to the wind, the leaves rustling softly as the last light of day disappeared. I decided to follow the melody. There was something in it, something that beckoned me forward, drawing me like a moth to a flame. The deeper I walked into the woods, the louder the tune became. It was as if the river itself was calling me, coaxing me closer with its song. And then, as if the forest had parted to reveal its secret, I found it, the river. It was more beautiful than I could have imagined. The water was clear, its surface shimmering in the fading light, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. The trees lined its banks, their branches hanging low as if to touch the water, and the song came from the river itself. It wasn't a tune played by an instrument, nor was it the voice of a person. It was something more ancient, more profound. A song without words. A song that seemed to carry the weight of all the years the river had witnessed. I stepped closer to the water, my breath catching in my throat. The melody wrapped itself around me, soothing the tension in my shoulders, easing the knots of exhaustion from my body. The song felt like a balm to my soul, a gentle reassurance that everything would be okay. In that moment, I felt as though time had slowed down. The worries of the world, the stresses of my life melted away. All that mattered was the song, the river, and the peace it brought. But as I sat by the riverbank, I realized something. The melody wasn't just beautiful, it was strange. There was a sadness hidden in its notes, a longing that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a song of joy, but of something else, something lost, something that couldn't be regained. I wasn't alone. I don't know how I knew it, but the thought hit me with a sudden clarity. The melody had changed, and now it seemed to be speaking to me. There was a subtle shift, a deepening of the sound that felt ... personal, like the river was not just playing a song, but sharing a secret. And then I heard it so faint, so quiet, that I almost thought I imagined it. A voice. It wasn't loud or clear, but it was unmistakable. A soft whisper, carried on the water. "Stay," it said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. There was a tenderness to them, but also an urgency. I felt it in my chest, like a pull at my heart. The river seemed to be asking me to stay with it, to listen to its song, to be a part of it. I stood there for what felt like hours, entranced by the sound, the whisper, the peaceful yet haunting tune. The night deepened around me. the stars slowly appearing above the water, their light soft and distant. The song had taken on a new tone, now calming, almost meditative. It was like a lullaby, lulling me into a trance. The rhythm of the water, the whisper of the trees, and the melody of the river all blended together into a symphony that seemed to stretch across time itself. And for a brief moment, I felt as though I had no need to go anywhere else. I could stay here forever, but as much as I wanted to, I knew I couldn't. I turned to leave, but the song followed me. It wasn't just in the river anymore. The melody was in the air, in the wind, in the very ground beneath my feet. It was everywhere, wrapping itself around me like a blanket, trying to pull me back. The voice whispered again, soft and pleading, but I didn't stop. My heart felt heavy with the weight of leaving, but I kept walking. When I finally left the forest and made my way back to the village, I could still hear the song echoing in my mind. The tune had settled in my soul, a quiet companion that I couldn't shake. I never forgot the hidden river. It was always with me, like a memory from a dream. Years have passed since that night, and I've returned to the river many times, though I never hear the song again. The melody, it seems, is only for those who are truly lost or seeking something deeper than themselves. But I carry it with me, still the song without words, the hauntingly beautiful tune that calms the soul. It's a part of me now, a quiet echo in the back of my mind that I can hear whenever I need it. The hidden river, with its song, will always be there, just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting to be found by those who need to hear it most. It's a song that doesn't speak of sorrow or joy, but of something more profound, a reminder that sometimes the most peaceful moments are the ones that can't be fully explained, but only felt. And if you listen closely, you may hear it too. The melody without words, floating on the wind, a song for the soul, forever whispering from the hidden depths of the river. I still remember the day I found the pendant. It was one of those afternoons that felt like time had decided to slow down. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over everything it touched. I was walking along the riverbank, as I often did when I needed a break from the noise of the world, the weight of daily life. The river, with its quiet murmur, had always brought me peace. But that day, there was something different in the air, something that seemed to whisper to me, calling me closer to the water. I had been walking for hours, letting my feet guide me through the overgrown path, when something shiny caught my eye. It was small at first, barely noticeable, half hidden beneath the wet leaves and soft earth near the water's edge. I knelt down, brushing away the debris, and there it was, a pendant. It was beautiful, delicate, and crafted with an elegance I hadn't expected to find here, so far from any town or market. The pendant was shaped like a teardrop, made of some sort of metal that had weathered over time, giving it a worn, antique look. What struck me most, however, was the engraving on the back, a name, Lydia. I turned the pendant over in my hands, examining the engraving. There was no other mark, no indication of who Lydia was or why this trinket was left here, abandoned by the river. The water lapped at the shore nearby, as if urging me to let it go, to leave it untouched. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I slipped the pendant into my pocket. As I stood, I felt a strange sensation crawl up my spine, a tingle, as though someone was watching me. I glanced around, but the forest remained quiet, the wind only stirring the leaves. The river's gentle murmur was the only sound, and yet something felt off. I decided to head back home, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the pendant was somehow more than just a forgotten piece of jewelry. It was like it held a story, one that had been lost to time, buried beneath the earth and water, waiting to be uncovered. And now, somehow, it had found its way into my hands. That night, as I sat at my small kitchen table, I examined the pendant again, this time more closely. The name Lydia seemed to resonate in my mind, echoing through the quiet of my house. Who was she? And why had the pendant ended up by the river? I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story than what I had uncovered so far. I placed the pendant on my windowsill, deciding to look into it tomorrow, but as I lay in bed that night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, the name Lydia filled my thoughts, and with it, a sense of unease. It was as if the name carried with it an unspoken sadness, an echo of something long past. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent the sensation became. The following day, I went to the local library, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on the pendant. The town was small, so I didn't expect much, but I had to try. After hours of searching through old records and town archives, I found a mention of a woman named Lydia, woman who had lived in the area many years ago, long before I had arrived. According to the old records, Lydia had disappeared without a trace. She had been a young woman, well liked by the townspeople, but one evening she went for a walk by the river and was never seen again. Her disappearance had remained a mystery, and despite search parties and inquiries, no one had ever found any clue that would explain what had happened to her. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the details. Could this pendant have belonged to her? And if so, why had it been left by the river all these years later? The questions only deepened the mystery, and I found myself consumed by it. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the river often. Each time, I couldn't help but feel that the water was somehow trying to tell me something. The gentle murmur of the current seemed to speak in whispers, and sometimes, just as the sun began to set, I could almost hear a voice. It wasn't clear, but it was there, lingering in the air. A voice that seemed to be calling out to me, as though asking me to listen, to understand. One evening, as I stood on the riverbank, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the cool breath of twilight, I saw something strange. The pendant, which I had kept safely in my pocket, slipped from my hand and landed on the ground. As it did, the water seemed to shimmer, its surface rippling as if responding to the sudden movement. For a moment, I thought I saw something beneath the water, a faint glow, like a flicker of light. I knelt down to retrieve the pendant, my heart racing as I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, I felt a sharp tug, like a jolt of energy running through my body. The sensation was intense, almost overwhelming, and I had to steady myself against the nearby tree to keep from falling. I looked out across the water, my breath shallow, and I swear I saw her, a figure, faint and shimmering, just beneath the surface of the river. She was there, looking back at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place: longing, sadness, maybe even relief. It was Lydia, or at least her spirit, lingering in the place she had vanished so long ago. As quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the soft ripples behind. The river returned to its quiet state, the murmur of the water now soothing, almost comforting. But I knew something had changed. I had found the pendant for a reason, and perhaps that reason was not just to solve a mystery, but to give Lydia the peace she had been denied for so many years. I never saw her again, but I would often return to the river, knowing that the story of the lost pendant was not just about a piece of jewelry. It was about the people, the lives, and the memories that the river held within its depths. I'd sit by the bank, the pendant safely in my hand, listening to the soft whispers of the water, and in those moments, I felt connected to something far greater than myself. A quiet, comforting presence that seemed to wrap around me, telling me that sometimes the greatest mysteries were not meant to be solved, but simply to be felt. I never believed in myths or legends. Like most, I had grown up with a healthy sense of skepticism, dismissing the fantastical stories told around campfires and whispered through generations. But that all changed the moment I found myself standing alone beside the hidden river, Gazing into its murky depths, feeling a sense of unease settle deep into my bones. The river had always fascinated me. It was a place of solitude and peace, where the world seemed to slow down. I'd often take long walks along its winding banks, listening to the murmur of the water, enjoying the calming rhythm it created. But lately, there had been whispers that grew louder as the days went by. It was a late afternoon when I first heard the stories. I was sitting at the small cafe in the village, sipping on my coffee, when an old man, one of the locals, leaned in close. His hands trembled slightly as he stirred his tea, his eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. I'd seen him many times before, but today he seemed different, as if burdened by a weight too heavy to bear. "You've been walking along the river, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, not sure where this conversation was going. He leaned even closer, his breath warm on my ear. "There's something out there, something that guards the river. A creature, a guardian." At first, I thought he was just another eccentric villager, caught up in some outlandish belief. But the fear in his eyes made me pause. There was a seriousness to his words, an unsettling sincerity that made me uneasy. He lowered his voice further, almost as if confessing a secret. "They say it's a creature of the water. Some say it's an ancient spirit. Others call it a guardian. It watches over the river, protecting its secrets. No one dares venture too far into the depths, especially when the sun begins to set. That's when it comes alive." His words were like a chill creeping over my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I laughed it off, attributing it to superstition. Still, the thought lingered in the back of my mind, haunting me, even as I walked home that evening. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what the old man had said, the guardian of the river. I found myself wondering if there was any truth to it, if something truly did watch over the river. I wasn't the type to believe in supernatural creatures, but there was something about the river that felt different lately. The gentle murmur of the water had taken on a more ominous tone, almost as if it was speaking to me, calling me. The next day, I decided to see for myself. I couldn't ignore the nagging curiosity any longer. I grabbed my jacket and made my way to the river once more, determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful again. The whispers of the past seemed to fade with each step I took, but as I ventured further along the riverbank, I began to feel an unsettling presence. It was subtle at first. A rustle in the bushes, a sudden movement just out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just the wind, the natural sounds of the forest, but the deeper I went, the stronger the feeling became. It was as if I wasn't alone, as if something or someone was watching me. I stopped at the edge of the river, my heart pounding in my chest. The water was still, its surface reflecting the sky above. But there, just beneath the surface, I could make out shapes, long, winding shadows that moved with the current. I blinked, certain that I was imagining it, but the shadows didn't disappear. They shifted and swirled, as if they were alive, watching me. A voice inside my head whispered, "Leave, go back," but I didn't. I couldn't. I knelt down, my fingers grazing the cool surface of the water. For a brief moment, I felt something stir beneath the surface, a ripple that sent a shiver up my spine. Then, out of nowhere, a low guttural growl echoed from the depths. I jerked back, my heart racing. There was no mistaking it. Something was down there, something alive. The sound grew louder, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very core of the river. I stumbled back in fear, my instincts telling me to run, to get as far away as possible. But before I could move, the water around me began to churn. The shadows beneath the surface grew more distinct, taking on the form of something large, something unmistakably alive. Suddenly, the water erupted, and from the depths emerged a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was massive, with sleek, dark scales that glistened in the fading light. Its eyes were deep, almost endless, and its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that took my breath away. It was the guardian, the mythical creature the old man had spoken of. It rose from the water, its body twisting and undulating, as if it were one with the river itself. I could feel the power in its presence, a force of nature that demanded respect. It didn't move aggressively, but there was an undeniable authority in its gaze, a silent warning that I was intruding on something sacred. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me, and for a moment, the creature simply watched me. Its eyes seemed to search my soul, weighing me, judging me. Then, as if satisfied that I was no threat, it slowly submerged itself back into the river, disappearing as quietly as it had appeared. The water returned to its calm state, and the sounds of the river's murmur filled the silence once more. But I knew things would never be the same. I had seen the guardian. I had felt its power, its presence, and I understood now why the villagers feared the river at dusk. I walked home that evening with a new understanding, the weight of the river's secrets heavy on my shoulders. The guardian was real, and it would continue to watch over the river, protecting its hidden truths for as long as it was needed. And I, too, would never be the same. The whispers of the river would follow me, always in the back of my mind, as I wondered what other secrets it might be hiding beneath its surface. But for now, I felt a strange peace. The guardian had shown me that there were things in this world far beyond our understanding, things we may never truly comprehend, but that we could learn to respect. And with that knowledge, I found a sense of calm that had eluded me for so long. As I sat by the river that night, I closed my eyes, listening to its whispers, knowing that, in some strange way, the guardian would always be there, watching over the river, protecting its secret sand, maybe, just maybe, watching over me, too. It was a moonless night when the villagers first decided to follow the whispers that had haunted the hidden river for generations. The air was thick with tension, a quiet unease that had settled over the village. For weeks, we'd heard the strange sound like a soft, haunting song carried by the wind, drifting from the direction of the river. It was a melody we couldn't quite place, familiar and yet foreign at the same time. No one knew its origin, and no one dared to venture too close, except for a few brave souls who had claimed to hear it. I, like most of the villagers, had grown up with a healthy fear of the river. It was a place of beauty, yes, but there was something about it, something hidden beneath the calm surface, that made me uneasy. It wasn't the murmur of the water or the rustle of the leaves in the tree snow. It was the way the river seemed to call, as if it knew secrets that were meant to stay hidden. I had heard the stories of the old guardian, of creatures lurking beneath the surface, but that was all they were stories that night, though. Something was different. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of energy that makes your heart race and your skin prickle. I could feel the pull of the river, even from the safety of my own home. And I wasn't the only one. As I walked through the village square, I could see others gathered, their faces drawn with worry, their eyes flicking nervously toward the forest where the river lay. Some were whispering amongst themselves, their voices trembling. "We should go," someone said, their voice barely above a whisper. It was Thomas, one of the braver villagers, the kind of man who never backed down from a challenge. "We've heard it long enough. It's time we find out what it is." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. We had all heard it, the song that seemed to dance on the wind, soft and melancholic, with a strange pull that seemed to reach into the very marrow of our bones. It was impossible to ignore, and yet none of us had dared to go closer. But tonight, something had changed. The moon, hidden behind a blanket of clouds, cast the village in an eerie darkness. The only light came from flickering lanterns, casting long shadows on the ground. The village was quiet, too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. "We'll follow the river," Thomas said, his voice firm, though I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "It's the only way to know for sure." And so we set out. A small group of us, no more than a dozen, gathered by the edge of the forest where the river began its winding path through the trees. The sound of the water was louder here, the whispers almost musical, though no one could quite make out the words. It was unsettling, like a lullaby meant for someone else, a tune that belonged to a time long gone. We walked in silence, our footsteps soft on the forest floor, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. The air was thick with tension, as though we were trespassing on something sacred. And yet none of us turned back. There was a strange sense of curiosity, an unspoken bond that held us together as we moved deeper into the forest. As we neared the river, the whispers grew louder. The sound was no longer just a distant murmur. It was close now, almost as if the river itself was speaking to us. My heart raced in my chest, my breath quickening with each step. I glanced around at the others. Some of them were holding their breath. Others looked as though they were ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. But still, we pressed on. Then, just as we reached the river's edge, it happened. The whispers stopped. A sudden, almost deafening silence fell over us, as if the very world had paused, holding its breath. The river, which had been flowing so steadily, suddenly stilled. The water shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the stars above, in a way that seemed almost unnatural. The shadows on the bank seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally long, as if they were reaching for us. And then, from the depths of the river, a sound began to rise. It wasn't the same whisper we'd heard before. No, this was something else entirely, a low, resonant hum, deep and ancient. It seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath our feet, sending a shiver up my spine. My skin prickled, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Whatever this was," someone whispered, their voice trembling. I couldn't see their face in the darkness, but I could hear the fear in their voice. "I don't know," I whispered back, my own voice barely a breath. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. The only sound now was the soft rustle of the trees in the wind and the distant croak of a night bird. "Let's go back," someone said, their voice cracking with fear, but none of us moved. We were frozen, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. I don't know why none of us ran. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was something else, something deeper, something that pulled us in, making us feel as if we had no choice but to stay. And then we saw it. From the water, rising slowly like something from a dream, was a figure. It wasn't a person, but something else, something more ancient, more powerful. It was cloaked in shadows, its form shifting and flickering like a wisp of smoke. And yet, there was a presence to it, an undeniable energy that sent a jolt of cold fear through my chest. The figure seemed to hover just above the water, its presence almost liquid, flowing with the river, as if it were one with the current. It had no face, but those eyes were a deep, dark black, like endless pits of nothingness. It stared at us unblinking, unyielding. For a long moment we stood there, locked in place, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, without a word, the figure faded back into the river, dissolving into the darkness from which it came. The river returned to its gentle murmur, the whispers picking up once more, though now they seemed different, softer, calmer, almost as if they were bidding us farewell. We didn't speak as we turned and made our way back to the village. No one asked what we had seen. No one mentioned the figure, but we all knew we had heard the river's song, and we had glimpsed its guardian, the one who watched over its secrets. From that night on, the river felt different to me. I no longer walked along its banks with the same curiosity. Now I walked with a respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the power it held, and whenever the wind would carry that haunting tune to my ears, I would listen, not with fear, but with gratitude. For the river had shown us its truth, and in doing so, it had whispered to us something far deeper than we could have ever imagined, and in that whisper, I found peace. The village I grew up in was surrounded by dense woods, the kind where the trees stood tall and silent, watching over the land with a quiet intensity. But it was the weeping willows that caught my attention. I remember the first time I really noticed them. It was late one evening, just as dusk began to settle over the land. The air was thick with the promise of rain, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped lower. The village was quiet, as it always was at this hour, with everyone indoors, preparing for the night. I had been walking along the riverbank, just outside the village, when I first heard it. A soft sound, like a distant sob, drifting through the air. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal hidden among the trees. But as I walked closer, I realized that the sound was coming from the weeping willows that lined the river's edge. They were ancient trees, their long, drooping branches swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves almost glowing under the fading light. The air around them felt heavier, thicker somehow, as if something ancient and powerful was lingering in the shadows. And then I heard it again, a soft, mournful sound, like the sound of someone weeping in the distance. I stopped in my tracks, my heart beating faster as I strained to listen. The weeping seemed to grow louder, more intense, as if the trees themselves were crying out in sorrow. It wasn't the wind that made the leaves rustle. No, it was something else, something more, personal. The melody in the air felt as if it were coming from the heart of the trees themselves, a song that was both beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Curiosity led me closer, though a sense of unease tugged at me, warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what it was. The sound was pulling me in, its haunting melody wrapping around my chest like a comforting but heavy weight. I reached out to touch the nearest tree, and as my fingers brushed against its rough bark, I felt a chill run down my spine. The sound seemed to come from within the tree, as though the very life force of the willow was singing to me, calling out in pain. The branches swayed again, but this time, they moved in a way that was not natural. They seemed to bend and twist, as if they were reaching for something or someone. The wind picked up, and I saw the leaves tremble, as if in response to some unseen force. I stepped back, my breath shallow, unsure of what to do. The air around me grew colder, and the weeping seemed to grow louder, as if the trees themselves were mourning something lost long ago. A shadow passed over the river, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving beneath the surface, something large and dark, undulating just below the water. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The river was calm again, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed. Something in the air felt different, as though the world itself had shifted. I walked back toward the village, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just experienced. The weeping willows, the mournful melody, it all felt too real, too haunting to be ignored. But as I reached the village, I pushed the thoughts away. Perhaps it was just my imagination, or maybe the wind had played tricks on me. After all, I had never heard of trees that cried before. But as the days went by, I began to notice something strange. Whenever I passed by the weeping willows, I would hear the faintest hint of that same melody, drifting on the breeze. At first, it was so quiet that I thought I was imagining it. But soon I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound was real. The trees were singing, weeping, calling to anyone who would listen. I started asking around, curious if anyone else had noticed. The older villagers were hesitant to speak about it. They would look over their shoulders, glancing nervously before lowering their voices and telling me to stay away from the river at night. There were old stories, they said stories, about the river's guardian, about the spirits of those who had long since passed. And the weeping willows, it seemed, were tied to those stories in ways that no one could fully explain. One evening, I sat down with old Edna, one of the village's oldest residents. She had lived through everything, from storms to harvests, and had seen the village change in ways that no one else could. Her face was lined with years, and her eyes had the distant, knowing look of someone who had seen things others couldn't. I asked her about the trees, about the weeping, and for the first time, she didn't brush it off as nonsense. "The trees are mourning," she said, her voice low and quiet. "They're crying for those who have been lost to the river, for the souls of those who never made it across." I frowned. "But what do you mean? The river's calm, isn't it?" Edna nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a kind of resignation. "The river is always calm, child. But that doesn't mean the river hasn't taken, and the willows, they've seen it all. They hold the memories of the river's past." Her words haunted me, and from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the weeping willows knew something that I wasn't supposed to understand. I tried to ignore it, to move on with my life, but every time I passed the trees, I felt their presence more acutely. I could almost hear them whispering to me, urging me to listen, to understand. One night, I decided to return to the river, alone this time, to face whatever had been calling to me. The moon was full, casting its pale light over the water as I approached the weeping willows. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the faint scent of pine. The river was eerily quiet, but I could feel the tension in the air, as if something was waiting. I stood at the river's edge, staring at the trees, and for a moment, everything felt still, frozen in time. Then, just as I had expected, the sound began the faint, mournful melody. It was as if the trees themselves were singing a song of loss, of longing, of memories too old to remember. The branches of the willows began to sway, their leaves rustling softly, but there was something more to it now. The sound was deeper, more resonant, as though it was coming from deep within the earth. I closed my eyes and listened. The song, though sad, was beautiful, and in that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't fear that I felt, but understanding. The weeping willows weren't just trees. They were the keepers of the river's secrets, the mourners of all that had been lost. And as the melody played, I realized that they weren't crying for themselves, they were crying for all of us, for the stories we never tell, for the things we choose to forget. As I stood there, listening to the song, I felt a shift deep within me. The trees had spoken, and I had heard them. The river's secrets, though still hidden, had been shared with me in a way that only the earth could understand. And as the song faded, I turned and walked back toward the village, carrying the weight of the trees' sorrow with me, but also their quiet peace. From that night on, whenever I passed the weeping willows, I no longer feared them. I understood them. And I knew that, sometimes, the greatest stories are the ones whispered by the wind, carried by the trees. The village I grew up in was small, nestled between the thick forest and the winding river that stretched like a silver thread through the land. There was an air of quiet mystery about the place, a calm that settled over everything until the sun dipped below the horizon. That's when the whispers began. I remember the first time I truly heard them. I had been playing near the riverbank, as children often do, when the wind picked up. It wasn't an ordinary breeze, was different, colder, with a soft hum in the air that seemed to carry a melody. The trees along the river's edge swayed, and in their rustling leaves, I heard something faint, a sound I couldn't quite place. It was as if the river was speaking, or perhaps the trees were singing, but I was young. And the village elder had always told us that the river held secrets we were better off not knowing. So, like the other children, I ran back home, dismissing the strange sound as nothing more than the wind. It wasn't long after that when I began to notice something else. The village elder's warning. It was always there, an unspoken rule passed from one generation to the next. We were to stay away from the river at night. The elders would whisper to the children, telling stories of the river's mysterious past, how it had once swallowed up anyone who ventured too close, how it was said to be a living entity with a mind of its own. It was as though the river had its own will, and those who didn't respect it were never seen again. I didn't understand those warnings at the time, of course. I was just a curious child, eager to explore the world around me. But as I grew older, I started to feel the weight of the village's collective silence about the river. Every time I passed by the elder's house, I could see him watching me from his window. His eyes filled with a quiet concern, a warning that seemed to hang in the air, unspoken, but always there. One evening, when I was in my late teens, the curiosity that had long been bubbling inside me finally took hold. I knew the village's warnings. I knew what the elders had said, but I had to see for myself. I had to understand what the river was hiding, what it was that had kept the village in such quiet fear for generations. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the land, I made my way to the riverbank. The trees were still, their leaves barely rustling in the evening breeze. The water was dark, like ink, reflecting the stars above, but there was something strange about it. The usual hum of the river seemed absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I could feel the weight of the air around me, as though it was holding its breath. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers, the same whispers I had heard as a child, began to return, but now they were clearer. The sound seemed to come from the depths of the river, rising from the surface like a soft, melodic tune. It was hypnotic, almost soothing, but there was an underlying chill that ran through it. And then, out of nowhere, I felt a presence behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. I turned slowly, half expecting to see one of the villagers, maybe even the elder, who had always watched me with that knowing gaze. But no one was there. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if something was standing just beyond the reach of my vision, watching, waiting. I didn't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, but eventually the whispers died down. The river returned to its usual murmur, the sound of the water flowing gently against the rocks. But the weight in the air remained. I turned to leave, my feet moving almost on their own accord, my mind racing with questions that I couldn't answer. The next day, I found myself walking toward the elder's house, an unease in my chest that I couldn't shake. I had to know what had happened by the river. I had to understand why the village was so afraid. When I arrived at his doorstep, I found him sitting outside, as he often did in the late afternoons, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could tell he knew I was there. "You went to the river last night, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and steady, though there was an edge to it, something unspoken. I nodded, my mouth dry. I heard the whispers again, the melody. "What is it? What's at the river?" The elder didn't answer immediately. He simply stared ahead, his gaze distant, as though he were lost in thought. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice soft, almost reverent. "The river has always been there," he began. "It's older than any of us, older than the village, older than the trees. The river holds the memories of everything that has passed through it, of everything it has taken, and it whispers those memories to those who listen. It calls to them, luring them in, drawing them closer. But why? Why does it call?" I asked, my curiosity rising. He turned to look at me then, his eyes sharp and filled with an ancient sadness. "Because it has an agreement, a pact, if you will, a pact with the land, with the trees, with the very souls that walk this earth. The river does not take without reason. It only takes when it is called upon, when the pact is broken. I didn't understand. What do you mean? Who calls on it? The elder sighed, as though the weight of his words had finally caught up with him. The river takes those who are lost, those who seek something that should not be found. It doesn't take them out of malice. It simply fulfills its part of the pact. And when the melody plays, when the whispers rise from the depths, it is a sign that the pact is being called into question again. That is when we must be careful. That is when the river seeks to claim what is owed. I felt a chill creep up my spine. So, you're saying, the river takes people? It takes them when they listen to the song? The elder's expression hardened. No one knows exactly how the pact was made, but there are those who believe that the river claims a soul every time it is called upon. Every time someone steps too close, too far into its reach, they are claimed. I swallowed hard, the realization sinking in. And the villagers, they stay away for a reason, the elder interrupted gently. Not out of fear, but out of respect. The river is not something to be trifled with. It has its own rules, its own rhythm. And if you listen too long, if you try to understand it, it will take what it's owed. I stood there, trying to process what he had said, the weight of his words pressing down on me. It was too much, too overwhelming to grasp all at once. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. The whispers, the song, the strange feeling that hung in the air when I was near the river, it was all part of something ancient, something that had been woven into the very fabric of the land. I never wanted to go against the pact, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to know the truth. The elder's eyes softened. Sometimes the truth is a burden, child. And sometimes it's better to let the river keep its secrets. The villagers have lived here for generations, and they've learned that some things are better left unknown. The river will always be there, but not everyone who listens to it returns the same. And with that, the conversation ended. But the weight of his words lingered in my mind for weeks to come. The river, its whispers, its song, it all felt like a part of something greater, something I couldn't fully understand. And as the days turned into months, I learned to stay away from the water at night, to heed the elder's warning. Because some things, as I came to understand, are better left untouched. Some songs are best left unheard. It was a quiet afternoon when I stumbled upon the old, forgotten diary. The air had that crispness, that strange stillness that often fills the space before the evening. I was out walking near the river, something I did often, but this day felt different. There was something in the air, an almost imperceptible pull, a sense that the earth was holding its breath. I had spent years in this village, surrounded by stories of the hidden river. The elders often spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices heavy with mystery, as if the river was not just a body of water, but a living, breathing entity with secrets far older than time itself. They spoke of its beauty, its serenity, and then they would grow quiet, their eyes distant, as if remembering something they could never quite explain. But they always warned us not to go near it after dusk. They said the river held stories, stories that would swallow you whole if you dared to listen too long. That afternoon, as I wandered along the bank, my feet carrying me toward an old, weathered oak tree, I noticed something odd in the dirt beneath its roots. It was a small, leather-bound book, its edges frayed and worn. Curiosity gripped me, and I crouched down, brushing away the dirt and leaves that had gathered over the years. The journal felt cold in my hands, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. Opening it, I was met with faded ink, the words barely legible, but there was something about the handwriting, something familiar. It was as if the person who wrote it had poured every ounce of their soul into those pages. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a chill run through me as I flipped through the first few pages. The entries were short at first, simple, but then, As the days went on, they became darker, heavier. The first few entries spoke of a young woman. Her name was Clara, written carefully at the top of the first page. She wrote about her life in the village, about the peaceful days by the river, and the people she loved. But as I read further, the tone of the diary began to change. Clara wrote of a strange presence by the river, something she couldn't explain. At first it was subtle, a fleeting sensation that would come over her when she sat by the water, as though the river was watching her, waiting for something. Would the river ever call to me again? Would it always be there, waiting, with its song and its secrets, waiting for the next soul to listen? I still remember the day I first saw them, the faces in the water. It's funny, how something so ordinary, something as simple as a river, can become so unsettling when you start paying attention. I had always known the river, of course. It ran just beyond the village, a quiet, serene flow that wound through the landscape like a lifeline for the townsfolk. We all grew up near it, and while we would occasionally hear the older villagers speak of it, with reverence, almost fear, none of us gave it much thought. It was just a river, after all. Nothing special, but that day changed everything. It was late afternoon when I decided to take a walk by the river. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, and the sky was a dull, overcast gray, the kind of sky that hangs low and makes everything feel still, almost too still. I had been walking for a while, lost in my thoughts, when I found myself at a part of the river I didn't often visit. The bank here was steep, and the water was darker, deeper. The trees grew thicker around the edges, their branches stretching like fingers over the surface of the water. I don't know why, but something about it drew me closer. Perhaps it was the silence. There was no one else around, no birds, no rustle of wind in the leaves, just the soft lapping of water against the shore. As I knelt down by the river's edge, I felt a strange chill run up my spine. It was almost as if the river itself were waiting for something. I gazed into the water, half expecting to see the reflection of the trees or the cloudy sky. But instead, what I saw made my heart stop. At first it was just a flicker, a movement out of the corner of my eye. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, or the ripples on the water, but then it came into focus. A face, a pale, gaunt face, staring back at me from beneath the surface. It was clear enough for me to see the hollow eyes, the mouth slightly open as though caught in a silent scream. The face seemed so vivid, so real, that I instinctively pulled back, my heart racing in my chest. But when I looked again, the face was gone, replaced by nothing but the still water. I breathed a sigh of relief, chastising myself for letting my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I decided to leave, to put some distance between myself and whatever strange thing I had just seen. But as I turned away, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a soft sound at first, a murmur, like a whisper rising from the depths of the river. I stopped dead in my tracks, my ears straining for the source of the noise. It was a voice. I was sure of it, faint, like a breath on the wind, but unmistakable. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for it to come again. And then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. Look again. I turned back toward the water, my pulse thumping in my ears. I didn't want to. I didn't want to look, but something inside me urged me to do it anyway. So, slowly, cautiously, I knelt down once more, and there, reflected in the water, were more faces, dozens of them, staring up at me from the depths. They were all different, some young, some old, all with expressions of sorrow, fear, or desperation. Their eyes were wide, pleading, but what was most unnerving of all was that none of them moved. They just stared, their faces frozen in that eerie stillness, as if they had been waiting for me all along. I recoiled, scrambling backward, my breath coming in short gasps. It felt as though the river had reached up and grabbed hold of my very soul, pulling me deeper into its secrets. I tried to shake the feeling, to stand up and run away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. It was then that I heard the whisper again, softer this time, as though the river was speaking directly into my mind. We are the forgotten, the lost, the ones who have been claimed by the river. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the truth of it. These faces weren't just reflections. They were the faces of those who had disappeared near the river over the years, some lost to the current, some taken by the unseen forces that seemed to haunt these waters. It was said that those who went missing near the river often left no trace behind, as if the water itself had swallowed them whole. And now, I was seeing the consequences of that, the faces of the lost, trapped in the reflection of the water, forever staring back at those who dared to look. I don't know how long I stayed there, caught in that moment, but eventually, I managed to pull myself together. I stood up shakily, backing away from the river. The whispers faded, but the faces remained in my mind, burned into my memory. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. The villagers would think I was mad, or worse, they would warn me to stay away from the river forever, as they had warned so many others before me. But I couldn't ignore what I had witnessed. It wasn't just a hallucination, a trick of the light. It was real, and it was something that had been happening for years, something that had been hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And so, I kept the secret, but I never went back to that part of the river again. I couldn't bring myself to. Even now, as I sit here, I can still hear the faintest of whispers when I close my eyes, soft and haunting, like a melody from another world, one that calls to me from the depths of the water. I don't know what it all means. I don't know why the river holds these memories, these souls, trapped in its reflection. But one thing is certain, I will never forget the faces. They are still with me, always, and sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I wonder if they will ever come for me. If the river, with its whispering, haunting call, will reach out and claim me like it claimed the others. But that's a thought for another time. For now, I'll keep my distance. And if you ever find yourself near that river, I urge you to remember the faces. Look away and never listen to the whispers. For once you do, you may find yourself joining them, trapped beneath the surface, where the river's secrets are never meant to be revealed. I still remember the first time I heard it. The melody, soft at first, like a lullaby carried by the breeze, had a way of reaching deep into your chest, soothing you in a way no other sound could. The village was peaceful, nestled along the banks of the river, and for as long as I could remember, the river had always been a source of comfort. It whispered gently to us as it flowed, a constant companion in our daily lives. But that day was different. It had been a long day, the kind that left you feeling heavy, your bones aching for rest. The sun was setting, casting a pale orange glow across the sky. I found myself walking alone by the river, as I often did, just to clear my mind. The village was quiet, the usual noise of children playing and dogs barking absent, as if the entire world had gone still. I had become accustomed to the sound of the river, the gentle splashing of water against the rocks, the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. It was a soothing sound, one that calmed the mind and prepared it for sleep. But that night, the river had something else in store. As I walked along the edge, I heard it faint at first, like a distant echo, just barely on the edge of hearing. It was a melody, a song, the kind of tune you'd hear in a dream. The sound wasn't coming from the trees, nor from the wind. It was coming from the river itself. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. The melody seemed to rise from the depths, carried by the current, drifting through the air. It was haunting, beautiful, almost like it was meant for me. The sound was so soft, so sweet, that I felt as though I could float away with it. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, the kind of melody that made your soul ache with longing. It felt like it had been playing for centuries, perhaps longer, waiting for someone to hear it. It was at that moment I realized that I wasn't alone. There was something else with me, something in the air that wasn't quite right. I took a step forward, my feet barely making a sound on the soft earth beneath me. The closer I got to the water's edge, the clearer the melody became. It wasn't just a song anymore, it had changed. It shifted, like the wind changing direction, and I could hear something else beneath the melody, something darker, more urgent. It was a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I leaned closer, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of the words. The whisper seemed to be coming from the water itself, as though the river had a voice that had been waiting for me. The words were unintelligible at first, just fragments, like a secret too old to be told. But then the melody faded, and the whisper grew clearer. It was a voice, low and rasping, speaking directly to me. "Come closer. Listen. Listen to me." My heart skipped a beat, my mind racing. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the whisper echoed through the still air. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the very earth was holding me there, keeping me in place. It was as if the river had claimed me, as if I had no choice but to listen. The voice came again, the words now more urgent, more insistent. "You hear me, don't you? You can hear my voice. You must listen." I don't know why I stayed, why I didn't run screaming from the river. There was something about the voice, something in it that held me there, that made me feel like I had no choice but to listen. It wasn't angry or cruel. It was something else, something sorrowful, something that carried with it the weight of years, of centuries, of secrets too heavy to carry alone. "I've waited so long, you must know. The river calls to you, it calls to you all." The whisper seemed to rise from the depths of the water, its tone growing more intense, more desperate. It was as though the river itself was alive, aware, waiting for me to understand. I could feel the weight of its words pressing in on me, suffocating me, pulling me in. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't tear myself away from the water. My eyes were drawn to the surface, to the ripples that danced in the moonlight. The whisper grew louder, the melody now distorted, twisted by the voice that came from the depths. "Don't turn away. I have something for you." It was then that I saw it, a figure rising slowly from the water, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes dark and empty. The figure seemed to float, its form barely visible in the moonlight, yet unmistakable. It was as if the water had given birth to this figure, as though the river itself had shaped it, formed it, and now it was reaching out to me. The voice came again, a final whisper, softer now, almost pleading. "Take it. Take the gift, the river's gift. It's yours now." And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure vanished, sinking back into the water, leaving only ripples behind. The whispering ceased, the melody fading into the silence of the night. The air seemed to clear, and I could hear the normal sounds of the village again, the distant calls of crickets, the rustling of leaves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart still racing, my body trembling. The river had returned to its calm, peaceful flow, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. Something had changed. The melody, the whisper it, had all been real, and it had been meant for me. I didn't know what it meant or what had been offered to me, but I could feel it in my bones, the weight of the river's secret pressing against my chest. The voice had been clear, the message unmistakable. I had heard it, and now I could never forget. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The whisper still lingered in my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. It was a voice from the depths, a voice that had called to me, and now I was bound to it. Perhaps it was a warning. Perhaps it was an invitation. I didn't know. But one thing was certain, I would never be the same. The river's voice had been a gift, but it had come with a price I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. And as I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard it again. The faintest whisper, as soft as a breath brushing against my ear. You will return. You will listen again. I never thought I'd fall under the river's spell. Not like this. It's strange how something so beautiful, so calming, can also hold such power. I was just a young man back then, eager to escape the stresses of daily life. The village was small, peaceful, too peaceful sometimes, and I often found myself wandering toward the river to clear my head, to forget for a while. The river had always been a companion, its gentle flow whispering through the trees, pulling me into its embrace. It was on one of these quiet walks, after a particularly grueling day, when I felt it for the first time. The river was calling to me, in a way it never had before. At first I thought I was just imagining it, that my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But the closer I got, the stronger the pull became. It was like the river was alive, beckoning me, offering something that no one else could understand. The moon was high in the sky that night, casting its silver light over the water's surface. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows long and stretching across the ground. The air smelled sweet, earthy, like it always did after the rain. And there it was, something in the air, a melody, soft, distant, like the sound of a lullaby drifting across the water. It was as though the river itself was singing. I stopped at the water's edge, staring at the rippling surface, wondering if I was hearing things. The melody was so soft, so gentle. I felt as though I could float away on it, let it carry me downstream to some distant place. But there was something else, too, something deeper in the sound, a murmur, a whisper, calling me. I knelt down, my hands brushing against the cool water. It felt comforting, like the touch of an old friend. I could feel the river's power in its currents, an energy that pulsed beneath the surface, and the longer I stayed, the more it seemed to draw me in. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, letting the melody wash over me. I felt no fear in my peace. But as the night wore on, something strange happened. The water began to feel heavier, the current stronger. Like it was no longer just water, but something more, something ancient, something waiting. I could feel it in my bones, a pull that went beyond the physical, a call that reached deep into the soul. I should have left, I should have stood up and walked away, but I didn't. I stayed. And the river, in its quiet, invisible way, embraced me. It wasn't like drowning. No, it wasn't harsh or violent. It was gentle, like a soft whisper that wrapped itself around you, pulling you closer, lulling you into a calmness so deep that you forgot where you were, who you were. The melody continued, soothing and soft, wrapping around my thoughts like a blanket. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time felt like it had stopped. I wasn't tired, but I felt content, almost as if I had found the answer to something. Like the river had given me all the peace I had been searching for. I could hear nothing but the music now, nothing but the steady flow of the river that seemed to promise something eternal, something unchanging. But then, as if from a great distance, I heard something else. It was faint at first, like a whisper barely caught on the wind. My name, it came softly, like the rustling of leaves in the breeze, calling me. Come closer, the voice seemed to say, though it was hard to tell if it was real or just a part of the river's lullaby. It was calming, peaceful, and yet there was a hint of something more, something that hinted at danger, though I couldn't place it. My mind began to cloud, the thoughts drifting like the water. I couldn't remember why I needed to leave. The pull was too strong, the song too sweet. The voice called again, a little louder this time. Stay with us, it said. Stay and listen. The water around me swirled, rising just a little higher. It wasn't enough to drown me, but it felt as though the river was holding me in place, refusing to let go. The whispering grew clearer, and I felt my eyelids grow heavy. My body relax in ways I hadn't known before. It was as if every muscle, every thought, was slowly being dissolved into the water, into the river's embrace. It was then that I heard something else, a voice, someone calling my name. This one was real, not part of the river's song, and it cut through the fog of my thoughts like a sharp knife. "Don't listen to it," the voice shouted. I turned toward the voice, suddenly aware of the world outside the water's embrace. There, standing at the edge of the river, was an old man, one of the village elders. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was waving his arms, shouting at me. "Come away from the river," he cried. "You mustn't stay. The river does not give without taking." It was only then that I realized what had been happening. The peaceful embrace, the gentle melody, it had been lulling me into something dangerous. The river wasn't just a force of nature. It was something more, something older, and it had a price. A price that I hadn't understood until that moment. With great effort, I pulled myself away from the water's edge. My body felt heavy, as though it didn't want to move, as though it was fighting me. The song grew fainter, the pull weakening as I stepped further away from the river. But the gentle embrace of the water lingered in my mind, pulling at my thoughts, whispering promises of peace. The elder reached me then, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the water's edge. He was breathless, his face etched with worry. "You're lucky," he said softly. "No one can stay with the river for too long. It offers its peace, but it takes more than you realize. You may leave now, but the river will remember." I looked back at the water, its surface calm again, the melody fading into the night. The river, it seemed, had let me go, but I knew that it hadn't truly released MIT, had simply allowed me to leave, and I wasn't sure I would ever escape its pull. From that night on, the river's song followed me, not in sound, but in feeling, deep inside. I knew it would always be there, waiting for those who lingered too long, offering its gentle embrace to anyone who needed peace. But the river's peace came at a cost, and I had learned that the hard way. I never went back to the river after that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that if I did, the river would call to me again, and this time I might not be so lucky. I grew up in a small village nestled between thick woods and a winding river that the locals always whispered about. The village itself was peaceful, a place where everyone knew everyone, and time seemed to stretch out lazily, like the river that flowed nearby. But there was something strange about that river, something most of the villagers rarely talked about. It was the way it beckoned, the way it seemed to call out, and the way the water could be as still as glass one moment and swirling with life the next. It was not an old story, but a story that had never quite been forgotten. There was a melody, a soft, haunting song that seemed to rise from the depths of the river. It was said that the river's song could soothe the soul, calm the weary heart, and bring peace to anyone who heard it. But there was another side to the song, one that no one wanted to talk about. I was young when I first heard it. I had been walking along the stream one late evening, tired from a long day of work in the fields. The air was warm, but there was a coolness to the breeze that whispered through the leaves, and as I walked, I heard it. The song, it was faint at first, a soft hum on the edge of my hearing, barely perceptible, but it grew, slowly, drawing me in, calling me closer. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. I couldn't explain it, but the sound felt familiar, almost like a lullaby from a forgotten dream. I remember standing by the riverbank, listening intently. It wasn't a song I had ever heard before, not in my own life anyway, but there was something in the melody, something so sweet, yet so sad. It was the kind of sadness that tugs at your chest, that you can't escape. It made me feel as if I had lost something long ago, something I didn't even know I was missing. I don't know how long I stood there listening to it. It wasn't until the sound began to fade that I noticed I wasn't alone. At the edge of the river, where the trees seemed to bend toward the water, stood an old man watching me. His face was lined with age, but his eyes, those eyes seemed to see through me, deep into my very soul. I don't remember walking up to him, or how long he had been standing there, but when I looked at him, I could see the sadness that mirrored my own. "Do you hear it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze never leaving the river. "The song of loss," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's the river's way of remembering those who have disappeared." I didn't understand. I had heard stories, of course. Stories of villagers who had gone missing, drawn to the river, never to return. But those stories were always told in hushed tones, dismissed as old wives' tales, myths passed down through generations. "The river takes," the old man continued, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "It calls to those who are lost, those who are seeking something, peace, answers, anything. And when they listen long enough, when they follow the call, the river takes them." And the song, he paused, his eyes flicking to the water. "The song is their memory, a way for the river to mourn them, to remember them." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to believe him, but somehow, deep down, I knew that what he was saying was true. There was something in the water, something that had been there long before I ever arrived. That night, I couldn't sleep. The song echoed in my mind, its sweet sorrow curling around my thoughts like a cold mist. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the feeling that I had heard something far more than just a melody. It was a memory, a lost one. The next day, I decided to return to the river. The old man's words had stayed with me, and curiosity, mixed with a sense of foreboding, pulled me back. As I walked down the familiar path, I couldn't shake the image of the faces I had seen in the water, faces that shouldn't have been there. When I arrived at the riverbank, I felt the same pull, the same sense of longing, as though the water was calling me once again. This time, though, I was prepared. I stood at the edge and listened, carefully, intently. The song was there, just as before, soft and sad. But as I stood there, something changed. The water shimmered, and through the ripples I saw them. Faces faint, almost transparent, but unmistakable. Their eyes were wide with a kind of sadness, the kind of sadness that only comes from knowing that something precious has been lost forever. I gasped and stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The faces lingered for a moment, staring back at me with a longing that chilled me to my bones. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished beneath the water. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The melody continued to play, sweet but haunting, and in that moment I understood. The river didn't just take people, it kept them, holding them in its depths, where the song would forever remind them of what they had lost. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, before the old man appeared again. His face was even more sorrowful than before, as if he had seen something in the water that I hadn't. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his feet barely touching the earth as he moved toward the trees. "Remember," he said over his shoulder, "the river doesn't just take, it keeps, and those who disappear are never truly gone." I left the river that day, shaken to my core, but the song never left me. Every night, as I tried to fall asleep, I could hear it soft and mournful, a lullaby that seemed to echo from deep within my soul. It was the song of loss, the song of those who had disappeared, and the song of the river's eternal mourning. And now, even as I tell you this, I can still hear it in the distance, a gentle, sad melody, calling out to anyone who will listen, reminding us that some things, some people, never truly leave. They simply become part of the river, part of its song, waiting to be remembered. If you ever find yourself near the river, near the stream that winds through the trees, listen carefully. And if you hear that song, that soft, haunting melody, know that it is not just a song, it is a memory of those who disappeared long ago, and a memory of all that they left behind. And remember, the river is always waiting, always calling for the next lost soul to wander too close, so be careful. The river may call to you, but some songs are not meant to be heard. I remember it clearly, the night the river whispered to me in a way it never had before. It was the kind of night that could easily slip from your memory if you weren't paying attention one. Of those quiet evenings where the air felt thick with something unspoken, where the world around you seemed to hold its breath. The village was just as it always was, peaceful, serene, and untouched by time. The river, though, that was different. It always had a way of calling to me, pulling me in. Some nights it was just the sound of its gentle rush against the stones, soothing, like a lullaby. Other nights, though, there was something more to it, something hidden beneath the surface. That particular evening, as I walked along the familiar path by the river's edge, I felt it. It was subtle at first, like a soft pull in the air. I paused, glancing down at the water. There was something strange about it tonight. The river was glowing, just slightly, its surface shimmering with a pale, almost ethereal light. At first, I thought it was just the moonlight reflecting off the water. But as I stood there, the glow seemed to pulse, as though the river itself was alive, breathing. It drew me in, step by step. I wasn't sure what it was, but something deep inside me urged me forward, toward the light. The glow seemed to gather at a certain point along the bank, where a narrow, hidden path disappeared into the thick trees. The river's light made the path seem almost inviting, like it had always been there, waiting for someone to find it. I don't know why, but that night I felt the need to follow it. Something told me that I was about to uncover something that had been hidden for far too long. Maybe it was the pull of the river, or maybe it was the song I had been hearing, the soft melody that always seemed to rise from the water. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to see where it led. The path was narrow, almost swallowed by the trees, and the further I walked, the darker it became. The glow from the river faded as I ventured deeper, and I had to rely on the dim moonlight to guide me. The air was thick with the scent of earth and damp leaves, and the silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches. But there was something about this silence, something unsettling about it. It wasn't the usual quiet of the woods. It felt expectant, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened up to a small clearing, distant but still visible, illuminated the edges of the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. And in the center of the clearing stood an old stone archway, half covered in vines and moss. I had never seen it before. It wasn't part of the village, not part of the paths I had walked countless times. But here it was, standing as though it had always been a part of the landscape. I approached it slowly, my heart beating louder with each step. There was something about the archway that felt ... wrong. It wasn't just the way it stood there, hidden away in the woods. It was the way the air around it seemed to thrum with energy, a strange magnetic force that tugged at my very being. And then I heard it, a voice, soft but clear, coming from the direction of the river. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as I listened, it grew stronger, more insistent, almost pleading. It was the song, the same haunting melody I had heard so many times before. But now it was ... different. Now it was a whisper, calling to me, urging me to listen, to come closer. I stepped toward the archway, unable to stop myself. The closer I got, the more the voice seemed to swirl around me, pulling me in, surrounding me. And then I understood. The river wasn't just a river. It was something more, something ancient, something that had been here long before the village was built. In the river's glow, the path, the archway, was all a part of something much older than I had ever imagined. The air grew colder as I passed under the archway. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The song ceased, and the world held its breath. And then, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out to steady myself, but there was nothing to grab onto. I fell, tumbling into the darkness. But it wasn't a fall. It was a shift, as though I had stepped into another place entirely. A place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the real and the imagined, no longer held sway. When I opened my eyes, I was standing at the edge of the river again, but everything was different. The trees were taller, the water darker, and the glow that had once been gentle now seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The river was no longer just water. It was alive. And as I stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, I saw them. Faces in the water. They weren't just reflections, though. They were real, so real that I could feel their eyes on me, their longing, their sadness. I stepped closer, my heart racing, and the song returned, louder this time, but still a whisper, as though the river was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. That's when I realized the river wasn't just a part of the landscape. It was a keeper of secrets, a keeper of lost souls, of memories that had been forgotten. And the glow, the hidden path, the archway, was all part of the river's web, guiding those who were willing to listen to the truth, to the first clue of what had been hidden for so long. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in the river's depths, listening to its whisper. But when I finally turned to leave, the path was no longer visible. The archway was gone, and the glow. It had faded, leaving behind only the sound of the river's song, echoing in my ears. I returned to the village that night, shaken, and the next morning I could barely remember the details of what had happened. But the river's whisper lingered, soft and persistent, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. And now, whenever I walk by the river, I can still hear it calling, just beyond the edge of my hearing, waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to follow. I don't know if I'll ever find the path again, but I know one thing for sure. The river's secrets are far older than anything I could ever understand, and they're waiting, hidden in the glow, just beneath the surface. It was the kind of evening where the world feels quiet, almost as though it's holding its breath. The air was crisp, with just enough chill to carry a soft whisper through the trees. I had walked this path by the river countless times before, but tonight, something felt different. The soft murmur of the water, usually a comforting constant, seemed to have an undertone, something almost like ... a voice. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint presence that tugged at the edge of my mind. I had always loved the river, its gentle flow, and the way it seemed to carry secrets. There was a peacefulness to it, a calmness that seemed to seep into the very core of me. But tonight, it was more than just water moving over stones. It was something deeper, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and yet I couldn't turn away. I walked a bit farther along the riverbank, the sounds of the night surrounding me, the rustle of leaves in the trees above, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional splash of something small breaking the surface of the water. It was all normal, comforting. But then it happened. I stopped suddenly, my breath catching in my throat. From the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard laughter, a burst of joy, carefree and light, drifting through the night air. I froze, unsure if I had really heard it. The laughter echoed again, louder this time. It was a sound I recognized, a sound I couldn't quite place, but it felt so familiar. I looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, perhaps a family gathered by the water, their laughter rising in the night. But there was no one. The path was empty, the trees still. The laughter lingered in the air, as if carried by the wind itself, and I felt a shiver run through me. The sound wasn't just a random burst of joy, was full of warmth, a kind of happiness that felt personal. It felt like something I should recognize, something that belonged to me. But how could it? The only ones I knew who would laugh like that were no longer with me. You see, years ago, I had walked this very path with someone whose laughter was as familiar to me as my own breath. It was my sister Emma. We were children back then, exploring the riverbanks as if the whole world was ours to discover. Her laughter was always the loudest, the most infectious, and we would run along the river, making up games, chasing each other through the tall grasses. Those were the happiest times of my life. But that was before the accident, before she disappeared. The memory of her laughter, that sweet sound that used to fill our days, suddenly overwhelmed me. I could almost feel her presence beside me, like she was standing right there, just out of sight. The sound of her laugh echoed again, this time sharper, more distinct. I turned in a circle, my eyes scanning the darkened trees. There was no one, but the laughter didn't stop. It swirled around me, light and airy, but with a strange edge to it. It was both comforting and unsettling, like hearing a song you used to love, but realizing it was now tinged with sadness. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. The river, which had always been a quiet companion, now felt like a place full of whispers. The edges of the world around me blurred, and for a moment I felt as though I had slipped into a memory, a dream. I could almost hear Emma calling my name, urging me to follow, just like when we were children, chasing each other through the woods. But this was no game. This wasn't a dream. I took a step toward the water, my feet moving of their own accord. The laughter continued, growing louder. But now it was accompanied by another sound, a soft murmur, like a voice calling from the depths of the river. It wasn't Emma's voice. No, it was something else, something older, something deeper. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. The river was still, its surface smooth like glass. But beneath that surface, I could feel something stirring, something hidden in its depths, waiting for me to listen. The laughter, too, had changed. It was no longer just a memory of joy. It had become something more. A call, a beckoning, almost like it was inviting me to come closer, to uncover something that had been buried for years. I took another step, my heart pounding now. The sound of the river was louder, but there was a strange quality to it. It was almost as if the water itself was trying to speak to me, telling me something I didn't fully understand. The laughter mixed with the murmur, weaving a tapestry of sound that wrapped around me like a veil. And then I heard it clearly, a voice, soft and gentle, but with a sharpness that made my heart race. "Come closer." I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Emma's, but it wasn't just her voice. It was as if she were calling from somewhere far beyond, somewhere I couldn't reach. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, my body too heavy to move. The river continued to whisper, its song mingling with the echoes of laughter. And in that moment, I understood. The river wasn't just carrying the memories of the past, it was holding them, keeping them alive, waiting for someone to listen. The laughter I heard wasn't just the joy of a child. It was a memory, a moment suspended in time, a piece of Emma that had never truly left. The river, with all its power, had become a vessel for the past, a keeper of the echoes that lingered long after the world had moved on. For what felt like hours, I stood there, unable to tear myself away from the pull of the river's song. The laughter faded, but the Emma's voice remained, soft, gentle, like a whisper from another world. It was as if the river itself was offering me a memory, a moment to hold on to. And as I stood there, I realized that this was the river's gift to me. Not just the sound of laughter, but the chance to remember, to feel the joy of the past even as it slipped further away. Slowly, I turned to leave. The laughter, the voice, the song, all of it began to fade, like a dream slipping away with the dawn. But the river's whisper lingered in my ears, a gentle reminder that some memories never truly disappear. They simply wait, hidden beneath the surface, for the right moment to rise again. And as I walked back along the riverbank, I couldn't help but smile softly, knowing that no matter how far we go, the river would always keep Emma's laughter alive, echoing in its depths, waiting for someone to listen. I had always loved the river. There was something magical about it, something peaceful. The way it flowed endlessly, carrying the secrets of the forest, the memories of the land. I had been walking along its banks for years, but it was one evening that changed everything. It was late, the kind of evening when the sun has just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a soft twilight. I found myself walking alone, my footsteps soft on the earth, the whisper of the river close by. The gentle sound of water gliding over stones had always been a source of comfort to me. It was a place of solitude, where my thoughts could wander as freely as the current. But that night, something was different. There was a chill in the air that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual crispness that came with nightfall, but something heavier, a kind of presence that settled over me as I walked. I paused for a moment, looking at the river, the water still as glass, reflecting the dimming sky. But then, through the reeds on the far side of the bank, I saw it. A shadow. It was brief, just a fleeting movement, but it caught my eye. At first I thought it was the wind, perhaps a branch swaying or the rippling of the water. But there was something about it that didn't feel right. The reeds had moved, but no breeze had stirred. The shadow was too deliberate, too defined. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't natural. I stood still, my heart beating a little faster now. My breath quickened, and I strained my eyes to see better, to understand what I had seen. But the reeds were still, the shadow gone as quickly as it had appeared. I swallowed hard and took a step forward, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer, perhaps, moving quietly along the riverbank. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The soft sound of the river's flow seemed to grow louder, as though urging me to leave. But there was a part of me, curiosity, maybe, or some strange compulsion that urged me to move closer. I walked along the bank, my eyes scanning the reeds, the trees on the other side of the water, searching for any sign of movement, but nothing. Only the soft whispers of the water and the stillness of the night. I reached a bend in the river, a place where the trees gathered closer to the water, their branches hanging low, casting dark shadows across the path. The air felt thicker here, and the weight of silence pressed in around me. I paused, staring at the water, waiting. I don't know why, but I had this sense that something was watching me, something that wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something that was waiting for me to notice it. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it again, the shadow. It moved so quickly this time that I wasn't sure I had really seen it, but it was there, just beyond the reeds, the shape of it almost human, but too large, too heavy to be anything like a person. It was gone before I could blink, but I felt the air shift, like something had crossed in front of me. My breath caught in my throat. My skin prickled, cold and uneasy, as if something had passed over me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a deer. It was something else. I could feel it, a presence in the air around me, as though the forest itself had paused in its breath to watch. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The river, once so soothing, now seemed to be a place of secrets, whispering in ways I couldn't understand. I could almost hear the murmurs beneath the water, voices too soft to comprehend but unmistakable, as though they were trying to reach me, trying to tell me something. The shadows in the reeds stirred again, and this time I knew it wasn't just my imagination. There's something waiting, watching from the depths of the riverbank. It was so close, I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see it. I wanted to run, to leave this place and never return, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. I couldn't move. The shadow was still there, shifting slightly, just beyond the reeds, waiting for me to make the next move. I was paralyzed, my senses alert, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then, through the rustling leaves, I heard something. A soft sigh, barely a whisper, but it carried with it a weight of sorrow and longing. It was a voice, but not a human one. It was deeper, more ancient, as if it had come from the very earth itself. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The voice came again, this time clearer. Come closer. It was not a command, but an invitation, soft, almost pleading. I didn't move, my body still rooted in place, but my mind was racing. The river had always been a place of comfort, of memories, of peace. But now, it felt like it was hiding something ancient and powerful, a force beyond my understanding. The voice whispered again. The shadow among them shifted once more, a dark silhouette against the night. With a sudden jolt, I snapped myself out of my trance. My breath was shallow now, and the weight in the air seemed to press down even harder. I turned quickly, not waiting to see if the shadow would follow. I walked faster, my footsteps heavy against the earth, my eyes scanning the path ahead of me, afraid to look back. The river, which had always been a companion, now seemed like an unfamiliar, dangerous entity, watching me, waiting for me to return. As I walked away from the riverbank, the whispers faded, the weight of the night lifting ever so slightly. But I knew, deep down, that whatever I had glimpsed among the reeds, that shadow, that presence was still there. The river held its secrets close, its whispers hidden in the ripples, waiting for the next person to listen. And I couldn't help but wonder, who or what had been watching me from the shadows? What had the river seen over the centuries? What was it waiting to reveal? I didn't know if I would ever return, but part of me felt the pull-in invitation to understand the hidden depths of the river. But that was a question for another time. For now, I would leave its whispers behind and let the river keep its secrets, as it always had. I've always been drawn to the river, not in the way most people are, for a casual stroll or a moment of peace, but in a way that felt almost like a compulsion. There was something about it, the way the water moved, the sound of it trickling over rocks, the way it reflected the sky. But it wasn't just the river that called to me. It was a spot along its path that seemed to hold the most significance, a place where the melody of the river became clearer, as though it had a voice. I first noticed it on a late autumn evening when the sun had long set and the world was bathed in the soft glow of the moon. I was walking alone, my feet crunching on the fallen leaves beneath me. The air was crisp, the kind of air that carries a slight bite, but also has the smell of wood smoke and distant fires. As I walked, the river's song seemed to grow louder, pulling me in, guiding me to a place I had visited countless times before, but never quite in the same way. This particular evening, there was something different about the bridge that spanned the river, a bridge I had crossed many times in my life. It was an old wooden structure, creaking and swaying with the wind, the kind of bridge that looked like it might collapse at any moment, but never did. It sat at the spot where the river curved around a bend, a place where the water ran swift and deep, and where the sound of the current was louder, clearer, more persistent. I had always felt drawn to this spot, but tonight, something about it felt alive. As I reached the bridge, I paused. The air had shifted, a stillness hanging around the river that wasn't normal. The whispering sound of the water seemed to harmonize with the wind, creating a melody that I had never heard before. It was almost as if the river itself was calling to me, its notes clear, sweet, but at the same time haunting. I stepped onto the bridge, the boards creaking beneath me, the rhythm of the water below, almost like a heartbeat. The moment I crossed the threshold, the melody became clearer, sharper. I stopped in the middle of the bridge, leaning over the wooden railing, staring down into the water. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, casting an eerie glow. I could see the current moving swiftly, but something about the movement of the water seemed off. It wasn't just the ripples. There was something else beneath the surface, something that caught the light and moved with purpose. It was as if the river was alive, its depths hiding secrets that had been buried for generations. I stood there for a long time, listening, watching, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. The river's melody had shifted. It wasn't just water now. It was something more. A voice, soft and distant, but unmistakably real. A whisper. I felt it in my bones, creeping through me. A sound that called to me deep inside. Come closer. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, so clear that I thought it might have been my imagination, or the wind playing tricks on me. But as the seconds passed, I realized that the voice wasn't my own thought. It was something older, something that had been there long before I ever stepped foot on that bridge. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, almost like a plea. I leaned over the railing, my heart racing, my breath shallow. I could see nothing in the water, nothing solid, no face, no form. Just the rippling surface, the occasional swirl, the dancing reflections of the trees on the opposite bank. Yet, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Someone was there. The melody shifted again, no longer just a whisper, but a soft, aching song that seemed to come from the depths of the river itself. It was beautiful, tragic, like a memory of joy and loss all at once. The longer I stood there, the clearer it became. There was a story being told in the currents, one that I couldn't quite make out, but that felt so familiar. I had always heard rumors about this spot. The locals spoke of the bridge in hushed tones, especially on nights like this, when the air was thick with the whispers of the river. They said it was a place where things were remembered, where old souls could find their way back. But no one spoke of it openly, and when asked, people would only give vague answers or change the subject altogether. The stories were always about those who had crossed the bridge and never returned lost to the river. Swallowed by its depths, some said it was the current that claimed them. Others whispered of a darker force that lingered beneath the surface, waiting for the curious, the lonely, the brave, the ones who lingered too long. I had never given much thought to these stories before, but tonight, as the river's song wrapped itself around me, I felt the weight of every word that had ever been spoken about this place. It was as though I was hearing the stories first-hand, echoes of joy, of laughter, of voices that had once called out, now gone silent. And yet, the melody that played from the river seemed to carry those voices in its flow. Do not linger too long. The whisper was louder now, more distinct, like a warning, but it was too late. The pull of the river was undeniable. My feet, which had once felt so grounded, now seemed to drift toward the edge of the bridge, as though the water itself was calling to me. I stepped forward, closer to the railing, closer to the whispering depths. My breath caught in my throat as I peered down once more into the water, and that's when I saw it. A figure just beneath the surface of the water, moving slowly. It was only a shadow, but the shape was unmistakable human, or something that had once been human. The face was indistinct, but those eyes were clear, staring up at me, filled with sorrow and longing. They reached out to me, and for a moment I thought I could hear their voice in the melody of the river. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The voice was gone now, replaced by the rush of the water, the sound of the river returning to its natural rhythm, but the figure was still there, in the depths, watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between the whispers and the water, but eventually I turned and walked away. The feeling of the river's gaze stayed with me, even as I left the bridge behind. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. No one would have believed me, but I couldn't shake the memory of that figure in the water, the whispers that had led me there, and the melody that had sung the story of the river. I couldn't help but feel that the bridge was a place where the past and present intertwined, where memories floated to the surface, and where the river's song became the clearest, a place of both beauty and danger, where the whisper of the hidden river could be heard if you lingered long enough. Now, whenever I walk by the river, I hear it again, a soft song of loss, the echoes of joy, the warning to not stay too long. And though I never cross the bridge at night anymore, I know that the river will always be there, waiting, whispering. I had always been captivated by the river near my childhood home. It wasn't just the way it glistened under the sun or how it carved its path through the earth with effortless grace. There was something deeper about it, something mysterious that I couldn't quite understand at first. But as time went on, I realized it had always been there, quietly waiting for me to hear it. It was on an evening that seemed like any other when I first heard Etha's soft, mournful cry of the river. I was alone by the water, as I often was, sitting on the rocks that lined the edge. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted with streaks of purple and gold. The river was calm, as if it too was enjoying the peace of the evening. But then I noticed it. At first I thought it was the wind, rustling the trees, carrying some distant sound. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was coming from the river itself, a faint, melodic sound that seemed to ripple along with the current. It was soft, but unmistakable, like a whisper, like a song filled with sorrow and longing. I leaned in closer, listening carefully. The sound grew a little clearer, though still distant and unearthly. It wasn't just the murmur of water flowing over stones. It was something more, lament. The river, it seemed, was grieving. I couldn't explain why, but there was something ancient about that sound, as though it had been flowing for centuries, carrying the weight of forgotten sorrows. I had always known this river, its waters clear, its flow steady, but I had never heard it speak. Not until that moment. I'm not sure what made me stay, but I did. I stayed by the river, listening to its song of grief, feeling the weight of its emotion seep into my bones. It was as if the river was trying to tell me something, trying to reach me through its mournful tune. I wanted to understand it, to hear the stories it had been carrying for so long, but the words, the meaning, remained just out of reach. Night fell, and the temperature dropped. The water seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, its surface reflecting the faint glow above. The melody grew stronger, pulling me closer. There was something compelling about it, something that urged me to follow its call. As I moved along the river's edge, I thought back to the stories my grandmother used to tell me about the river. She often spoke of its power, how it could heal, but also how it could take without warning. She spoke of the old ones, those who had once lived by the river, long before my time. She told me how the river was a keeper of their memories, their pain, their joy. They had lived and loved beside the water, and when they had passed, they left their essence behind, woven into the river's current. I never really understood what she meant until that night. The river wasn't just a body of water, it was a vessel of memories, a keeper of grief. As I stood there, the soft song of the river filled the air around me, and I could almost feel the weight of those memories. I could hear the voices of the past, faint but real. They were the voices of those who had lived beside the river, the ones who had left their footprints in the mud, their laughter in the wind. I walked further, my feet steady on the familiar ground, but my heart heavy with the realization of what the river held. Each ripple, each wave seemed to carry stories of love and loss, of joy and sorrow. The river had been a witness to it all, and its song was the only way it could remember. Then I saw it. Just ahead, near a bend in the river where the water was particularly deep, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a reflection, though not my own. There, on the surface of the water, I saw faces. Faces I didn't recognize, yet somehow I knew them. They were faint, almost transparent, but they were there watching me from beneath the surface. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The faces seemed to shift with the current, moving as if they were alive, but not quite. They were sad, their eyes full of longing, as though they were reaching out to me. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. It was as though they were trying to communicate with me, trying to tell me something, but the words didn't come. I knelt down by the water, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. The faces seemed to shimmer in response, and the lament of the river grew louder, more desperate. It was then that I realized the river wasn't just carrying the grief of the past. It was mourning someone. It was mourning the lives lost, the hearts broken, and the souls that had never found peace. The faces, though faint, were clear now, and I could almost hear their voices in the wind. They were speaking to me, whispering their sorrow, their regrets. They had been waiting, it seemed, for someone to hear their story. And in that moment, I understood. The river was grieving for them. It was grieving for all those who had disappeared, those who had crossed its waters and never returned. Their lives had been swallowed by the current, their stories forgotten by time. And now, they lived on in the river's melodious song of loss that would never fade. I sat there for a long time, listening to the river's song, feeling the weight of its grief settle in my chest. The faces in the water faded, but their presence lingered. The river's tune had become a part of me, echoing in my mind long after I had left the banks. And though I couldn't fully understand what it had told me, I knew that I would never forget that night by the river, the night I heard its lament, the night I heard its sorrow. The water had its own story to tell, a story that would never truly end. For the river carried the grief of all who had come before me, and though I had heard its song, I knew that it would continue to mourn, to sing, to remember long after I was gone. As I walked away from the river, I felt a deep sense of peace. The sorrow of the water had been shared, and in that sharing, there was a kind of release. I didn't need to understand everything. Sometimes, the beauty of the river's lament was enough. Sometimes, simply listening to the sorrow and letting it wash over you was all that was needed. And so, I left the river behind, but the sound of its song, its mournful, ancient grief, stayed with me, a melody that I would carry with me always. A reminder that the river had its own story to tell, a story that was far older than I would ever truly understand. I had always been drawn to the river that wound through the forest near my childhood home. It was a place of peace where I could sit and listen to the soft, soothing melody of its water flowing, seemingly endlessly. But there was something more to it, something I couldn't quite grasp. I had always heard stories about the river, stories that my grandmother whispered to me when I was young. She spoke of its magic, its power, and the way it seemed to pull people in. But it wasn't until one particular evening that I realized how deeply the river was woven into the fabric of my life and into the lives of those who had come before me. It started on a warm, quiet evening when I decided to take a walk along the river's edge. The sun had just set, and the sky was bathed in soft hues of purple and gold. As I walked along the well-worn path, I could hear the familiar sound of the river's current, that gentle, almost musical hum that I had always found so comforting. The breeze was light, the air cool, and the world felt at peace until I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind or the rustling of the leaves. But then, as I stepped closer to the water, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a song, faint but unmistakable, drifting on the air. It wasn't like any melody I had ever heard. It was soft, haunting, and carried with it an ancient sorrow, a grief so deep it seemed to echo through the earth itself. I stood still, listening. The melody floated on the air, weaving through the trees, wrapping itself around me. It was as if the river itself was singing no mourning. But it wasn't just any sorrow. It was a sorrow of loss, of longing. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at my heart. It felt personal. I had heard this song before, though I couldn't place when or where. It was as if it had been with me all my life, buried deep within my memories. But how could that be? I had never been near the river when it sang. The song itself was something ancient, something beyond my understanding. I walked closer to the water, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. The river's surface shimmered, as if in response to the song, and there, just beneath the surface, I saw faces faint, translucent faces that seemed to be staring back at me, their eyes full of longing and sorrow. They were faces I didn't recognize, yet somehow they felt familiar. It was as if I had known them my entire life, though I couldn't explain how. I knelt down, mesmerized by the faces, and that's when I heard a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the river. The voice was like a breath, carrying a story, a message, though I couldn't quite make out the words. But there was one thing that I did understand. The song of the river, the faces in the water, the voice, they were all connected. Connected to something much deeper, something that went beyond the flow of the river itself. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to piece together the puzzle, but it wasn't until much later, when I returned home, that the truth began to reveal itself. As I sat by the fire, the images of the river's song and the faces still fresh in my mind, I realized something that I had never considered before. I remembered something my grandmother had once told me, something that had always seemed like a mere story, a warning passed down through generations. The river, she had said, doesn't just flow with water. It flows with memories, with the echoes of those who have crossed it. Some are lost to its depths, while others stay with it. I had always thought she was speaking metaphorically, but now I understood. The river wasn't just a physical place. It was a keeper of souls. It held the memories of those who had disappeared, those who had left without a trace, and it had been carrying their grief for centuries. The song, the mournful melody the first had heard, was their collective lament. It was the sound of lives lost, souls trapped in the river's flow, unable to find peace. The next day, I returned to the river, my mind racing with questions. I stood by the edge, the water moving gently in the late morning light, and then I heard it again, the song. But this time, it was clearer, almost as if the river was inviting me to listen, to understand. The faces appeared once more, and this time they were not as distant. They were closer, more defined, as if they were trying to reach out to me. I reached out a hand toward the water, my fingers barely brushing the surface, and for a fleeting moment I felt a connection, an undeniable pull. The faces, the voices, the song, they were all asking for one thing: to be remembered. The river, I realized, was not just a place of beauty. It was a place of mourning. It was a bridge between the living and the lost, a place where the forgotten could still be heard. The song of the river wasn't just a sound. It was a message, a call to remember those who had vanished. It was the song of the missing, the ones who had never returned, who had disappeared into the river's depths and been swallowed by time. The river was mourning their loss, their absence, and it had been waiting for someone like me to listen, to understand, and to share their story. I spent the rest of the day by the river, listening to its song, allowing its melody to wash over me, to become a part of me. The river's voice was clearer now, and I could almost hear the names of those who had vanished, their stories intertwining with the flow of the current. It was as if the river itself had become a living memory, a keeper of all the souls who had been lost to its waters. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water, I felt a deep sense of peace. The song had revealed its secret. It wasn't just a sorrowful tune, it was a plea. The river was asking to be remembered, to carry its grief and the grief of those who had crossed its waters. And I, by simply listening, had become a part of that memory. I left the river that night with a new understanding. The river's song would always echo in my mind, a reminder of those who had been lost, and of the river's eternal role as a keeper of souls. And though the river would continue to sing its song, I knew that I had heard it, truly heard it, and that I would carry its message with me always. The next time I return to the river, I will not be the same. I will be someone who has heard its secret, someone who understands the song of loss, the song of memory, the song of the missing, and I will remember, always. I remember the first time I heard the river's song. It was a melody so pure, so haunting, that it seemed to reach deep into my soul. I had always known that the river had a presence, something ancient and powerful, but it wasn't until that evening that I truly understood its pull. I was walking along its bank, as I had done countless times before, when the song started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the rustling of leaves in the trees. But then I realized it wasn't. It was a voice's soft, mournful cry woven into the flow of the river. The sound was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt wrong. It felt like a memory, distant yet familiar, tugging at my heart. I had heard stories about the river when I was young. My grandmother used to tell me of its magic, how it could heal, how it could call to people, pull them in. But she also warned me of the dangers, how it had a way of trapping souls, of keeping them bound to its waters forever. She spoke of lovers, too, those who had stood by the river, exchanging promises of eternal love, only to be torn apart by cruel fate. It was one of those stories that never quite left my mind, the kind of story that lingered, like a whisper on the wind. That night, as I walked along the river, I felt something shift in the air, something heavy and cold, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The river's melody grew louder, clearer, as if it were calling me. I had to know what it was, where it was coming from. My feet carried me down the winding path, past the reeds that brushed against my legs, past the towering trees whose shadows stretched like dark fingers over the water. And then I saw it. At the bend of the river, where the water slowed and pooled in a serene, almost otherworldly way, I noticed something out of place. It was a stone bridge, old and weathered, hidden from sight unless you knew exactly where to look. The bridge was ancient, covered in moss and ivy, but it had a presence. As I stepped closer, the air grew still, and the river's song seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. I knew then that the song was tied to this place, to the bridge itself. But as I stood there, listening, I heard something else, something I hadn't expected. A voice, faint but clear, riding the melody of the river. It wasn't just the sound of the river. It was the voice of a woman, soft, sad, almost desperate. Her words were broken, scattered by the current, but I could make out the plea in her tone. It was a whisper, full of longing and sorrow, as if she were calling to someone, waiting for them to return. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest as the voice continued to echo in the stillness. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in the voice, but eventually, I turned away from the river, the song still swirling in my mind. It wasn't until later that I learned the true story behind the voice, the story that had haunted the river for generations. The story was of two lovers, a man and a woman, who had once stood on that very bridge, exchanging vows of eternal love. Their love had been pure, unbreakable, or so they thought. But fate is a cruel thing. The man had been called away to fight in a war, to leave his beloved behind. The woman waited for him, her heart full of hope, knowing that he would return. She would wait for him by the river, the place where they had met, where they had first declared their love. But time passed, and the man never came back. One day, the woman stood on the bridge, waiting, as she had done so many times before. The river, calm and serene, flowed beneath her, carrying the song of their love. But as the hours passed and the night drew near, the woman's hope turned to despair. She searched for him, calling out to him, but he never answered. The river, as it had done countless times before, took him away, claimed his life in its depths. The woman, heartbroken and lost, threw herself into the river, following her love into the cold, dark waters. They say that her spirit still lingers there, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead, forever waiting for the man she loved to return. The voice I had heard that night was hers, a cry, a song, a lament for the love she had lost, a love that had been stolen from her by the cruel hand of fate. As I listened to the story, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sorrow, a deep, aching sorrow that seemed to fill the very air around me. The river's song wasn't just a melody, it was a memory, a memorial to the lovers who had been torn apart, their love lost to time. It was a song of loss, of grief, of the yearning for something that could never be. That night, as I lay in bed, the river's song filled my dreams. I could see the woman standing on the bridge, her eyes full of sadness as she gazed out over the water, waiting for the man she would never see again. I could hear her voice, calling, pleading, echoing through the night. And though I knew I could never change what had happened, I felt a deep sense of connection to her, to the love she had lost. It was as if the river had opened a door, allowing me to hear her pain, to feel her sorrow, to understand the depth of her grief. The next day, I returned to the river, drawn by the melody once again. The bridge was just as I had left it, the stone worn and weathered, the water flowing gently beneath it. But this time, as I stood there, I felt a sense of peace. The song of the river was no longer just a mournful cry. It was a reminder of love, of loss, of the things that shape our lives and our hearts. I stood by the river for a long time, listening to its song, letting the melody wash over me. The woman's voice, soft and distant, blended with the sound of the water. And for a moment, I felt her presence beside me. The river's song was no longer just a tale of tragedy. It was a testament to love, to the power of memory, to the ways in which the things we lose never truly leave us. As I walked away from the river that day, I knew that I would return again and again. The river's whisper, the song of the lost lovers, would always be there, waiting for those who would listen, those who would remember. And though I would never truly understand the depths of the sorrow that echoed through its waters, I knew one thing for sure. Some stories, some songs, are meant to be heard, and some loves, no matter how tragic, are never truly gone. I've always found comfort by the river. Its song, a delicate melody flowing over stones, carried an ancient, soothing presence that helped me escape the weight of the world. I often walked its banks in the quiet hours of the evening, when the last light of day bathed everything in a soft glow, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the space between dusk and night. I had heard stories about the river, of course. My grandmother used to tell me that rivers were like memories. They held secrets, stories of the past, whispers from long ago. But it wasn't until that night, that particular evening, when I truly understood what she meant. It was late, much later than I had intended to stay. The sun had long since set, and a cool breeze had begun to stir, carrying the scent of earth and water. The river, usually a gentle murmur, was louder tonight. The sound had a rhythm to it, a strange pull, like a song carried on the wind. I walked slowly, drawn toward it, my feet tracing the familiar path along the edge. It wasn't unusual for me to feel a connection to the river, but tonight there was something different. Something. Off as I walked deeper into the forest, the sound of the river grew louder, more distinct. I thought it might be the wind, perhaps the trees shifting in a way that made the river's flow more pronounced. But then I stopped. There was something in the air that I couldn't quite place, something thick with tension. The melody had changed, woven with an unmistakable rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. And then it happened. I heard it. A voice. At first I thought it was the wind again, bending the branches just so that it made an odd sound. But no, this was different. This was a voice, a whisper, soft and fleeting, but unmistakably human. The river, so quiet and serene by day, was speaking. My heart raced as I stood there, the darkness around me growing heavier with every passing second. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and I could just make out the words, faint though they were. Come closer. It wasn't a command, but a gentle invitation, a coaxing that seemed to seep into my very bones. I hesitated. The voice sounded so real, so human, yet it came from the river, from the depths of the water, as though the river itself had somehow taken on a voice. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. The melody of the river, which I had come to know so well, was now intertwined with words, with a whispering voice that seemed to beckon me forward. For a moment, I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what was happening. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer to the river, my feet barely making a sound as I moved through the underbrush. The air felt heavier, as though the very earth around me was holding its breath. The voice continued, now a little clearer. Come closer. You're not alone here. The words chilled me, and yet they carried an odd comfort with them, as if the river were trying to reassure me. I could feel the water's pull, like an invisible thread, drawing me toward the bank. I wanted to run, to escape the strange sensation that was building inside me. But something in the voice, in the way it seemed to know, kept me rooted to the spot. With each step I took, the voice grew clearer, its tones soft and sweet, like a lullaby. I knelt at the water's edge, my heart thudding in my chest, my eyes scanning the water. But there was nothing but the ripples of the river, the usual gentle flow. And yet, I could still hear the whisper, "Do you hear me?" The voice seemed so close now, so real, as though it was right next to me, just beneath the surface of the water. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Yes," I whispered back, almost without thinking. The moment I spoke, the voice fell silent, and for a brief, terrifying second, I thought the river had stopped, that everything around me had frozen in time. The silence was thick, suffocating. And then it came a soft sigh, like the river itself was exhaling. "I was waiting," the voice murmured, "waiting for you." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a cold, unfamiliar presence wash over me. There was something ancient, something sorrowful, in the tone of the voice. It was as if the river had been waiting for centuries, calling out to me, beckoning me to listen, to understand. I could feel the weight of the history in those words, the untold stories that the river held within its depths. For a moment, I was afraid, but then I remembered the stories my grandmother had told me, stories of the river's power, its ability to remember, to hold on to the past. Perhaps this was what she had meant all along. The river wasn't just a stream of water. It was a keeper of memories, a bridge between the living and the lost. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, carried away by the soft rush of water. The river seemed to pause, as though considering the question. And then it spoke again, the voice soft, but filled with a quiet sadness. "I am those who have gone. I am those who remain." I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment, I understood. The voice was not one individual, it was the voice of many, a chorus of souls, each carrying their own stories, their own regrets, their own hopes. The river had not just been calling me, it had been calling to all who had come before me, and to all who would come after. The voice lingered for a while longer, speaking in soft, soothing tones, as if sharing a memory, a fragment of the past. It told me of the lives that had touched the river, of the love, the loss, the joy, and the sorrow. The river had seen it all, carried it all within its depths. And now, it shared those stories with me, as if I were meant to hear them, as if I were meant to carry them forward. The longer I listened, the more peaceful I felt. The fear that had gripped me earlier began to melt away, replaced by a deep, overwhelming sense of calm. I felt a connection to the river, to the voices, to the past that flowed through its waters. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice grew quieter. The river returned to its gentle melody, its whispers fading into the night. I stayed for a long while, my heart at ease, the weight of the world slipping away as the river's song cradled me in its embrace. When I finally stood and turned to leave, I knew something had changed within me. The river had spoken, and I had listened. The stories of the past would never be forgotten as long as the river flowed, and the whispers would always be there, waiting for those who were willing to listen. I remember the first time I truly understood what it meant to feel the comforting touch of the river. I had always found peace by the waterite's gentle current, the quiet whispers it carried with the breeze. But there was a time, a long stretch of days, when peace seemed so far away from me. Life had taken its toll, and the weight of the world on my shoulders felt unbearable. The days blurred together, and I found myself walking to the riverbank more often than usual, searching for something, anything, that could help me find solace. That evening the sky was heavy with the promise of rain, but there was a calm that surrounded the river, as though the storm was being held back, just for a moment. I remember walking slowly, dragging my feet through the soft earth, my mind lost in thoughts that felt like endless waves crashing inside. The river was quiet, almost too quiet, and yet there was something so comforting about it. The soft ripples that ran over the smooth stones, the gentle rustling of the reeds, it all seemed so familiar, so safe. As I neared my usual spot, I felt a strange chill in the air. It wasn't cold exactly, but more like the shift of something unseen, a presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped for a moment, uncertain, but the river's pull was too strong. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though the river itself was calling me to sit by its edge. So I did. I sank down on a nearby rock, my eyes fixed on the water's surface. The sky above darkened, and I could feel the heaviness of the moment settle over me. I had been in despair for so long, and I wondered how much longer I could carry the weight of it. The river seemed to understand. It had always been there, a silent companion in my life. But this time, there was something different, a presence, not in the way of voices or shadows, but in the gentle hum that filled the air around me. It was as if the river was reaching out, offering something more than its usual quiet comfort. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, and then, just as the first raindrops began to fall, I felt it. A hand, soft, yet firm, resting gently on my shoulder. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It was more like a sensation, like a presence settling next to me, a weightless touch that felt as though it was wrapped in warmth and care. I opened my eyes, expecting to see someone, but there was no one, just the river, stretching endlessly before me. I sat there for a moment, my heart racing, my thoughts swirling. The touch was so real, so tangible. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was as if the river itself had reached out to me, a comforting hand from the depths of the water, offering me peace in a moment of turmoil. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. All I knew was that I felt seen. In that moment, I felt as though the river understood my pain, my sorrow, and it wasn't trying to fix me or give me answers. It was simply offering me comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone. The rain began to fall harder now, but the touch never wavered. It was a calm presence, like a friend sitting beside you, just being there. I could almost hear the river whispering, not in words, but in the flow of its current. "It's all right," it seemed to say. "You don't have to carry this alone." And in that moment, I didn't. The heaviness that had settled so deeply within me began to lift, just a little. It wasn't gone, not completely, but the weight was lighter, as if the river had absorbed some of it, leaving me with a bit more peace than I had before. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the rain falling around me, the river's gentle hum filling the space between us. The touch, though it had never been physical, felt more real than anything I had experienced in a long time. It was the river's way of reminding me that I wasn't alone in my pain, that no matter how much I struggled, there was something, somewhere, that cared. As the storm began to pass, I stood slowly, taking one last look at the river. The rain had softened into a steady drizzle, and the air felt clearer, lighter. The presence, was gone, but it didn't matter. It had given me something I hadn't even known I needed. A moment of quiet reassurance that things would be okay. Maybe not right away, maybe not perfectly, but there would be a way forward, and I didn't have to face it on my own. The river didn't offer any answers, and it didn't promise me that everything would magically get better. But it reminded me of something important, that comfort often comes not in grand gestures, but in small, subtle ways, in a touch, in a whisper, in the quiet presence that says, "You are not alone." As I walked back home that night, I felt different, lighter, somehow. The weight of my worries was still there, but it was no longer the crushing burden it had been. I carried the memory of the river's touch with me, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always a gentle hand waiting to guide us, to comfort us, to help us find our way back to peace. And from that night on, whenever I found myself lost in despair again, I knew where to go. I knew the river would always be there, offering its gentle hand, waiting to remind me that I wasn't alone in this world. The whispers of the hidden river would always be there, soothing my soul, guiding me through the hardest times, and reminding me that even in the quietest moments, there is still comfort to be found. The air felt heavy that night. It had been weeks since I had found any real peace, and the exhaustion of life had finally caught up with me. The weight of the world seemed to rest on my shoulders, each step I took feeling heavier than the last. I walked through the streets, aimlessly, my feet carrying me with no destination in mind. The city lights flickered faintly, offering no warmth, no comfort. But there was something pulling me, something I couldn't explain. Without thinking, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest, the familiar path leading down toward the river I had often visited. It was a place I had gone to for years when life felt overwhelming, when I needed to step away from the noise, the pressure, the expectations. The river had always been there, a quiet companion. But tonight, there was something different in the air. The usual rush of the river was softer, almost as if it were calling to me, whispering my name, asking me to come closer. I followed the path, my feet crunching on the gravel and dry leaves beneath me, the cool evening air surrounding me like a gentle embrace. The trees loomed tall around me, their branches heavy with the promise of rain. But I didn't care. All that mattered was reaching the water. The river had always been a place of solace, and tonight I hoped it would offer me the same peace it had in the past. When I reached the river's edge, the scene before me felt more serene than I had remembered. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the still water. It looked almost magical, like a scene from a dream. I sat on a smooth stone near the bank, letting the cool air wash over me. The river's gentle flow was the only sound, but tonight, something else seemed to stir within it. A soft melody, barely audible, drifted across the water. It wasn't the usual sound of flowing water or rustling leaves. This was different, a song. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too rhythmic, too deliberate. I leaned forward, straining to hear it more clearly. The song was soothing, like a lullaby, but there was something deeper within it, something almost ancient. The melody seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, one that resonated in the very core of my being. As I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, I felt the weight in my chest begin to lift. The heaviness, the worry, the exhaustion, all of it seemed to fade into the background. The river song was like a balm, gentle and healing, its notes weaving through my thoughts, soothing my racing mind. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the melody. Time seemed to stretch and blur, like I was caught between worlds. But in that moment, I felt an odd sense of calm. The river's song had become a part of me, wrapping itself around my heart, easing the pain I hadn't realized I was carrying. It was as if the melody had reached deep into my soul and started to heal the places that had been scarred by life's trials. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace. The burdens I had carried for so long, the fears that had gripped me, the self-doubt that had shadowed my every step of it was dissolving. The song of the river seemed to embrace my very essence, washing away the weariness, the sadness, the broken pieces of myself I had tried to hide. And in their place, there was a quiet strength, a renewed sense of hope. As the music continued, I realized something. The river didn't just soothe the heart, whispered a story of resilience, of healing, of the cyclical nature of life. The river had seen it all, the ebb and flow of time, the rise and fall of generations, the coming and going of storms. Yet, it persisted. It flowed unbroken, always moving forward. And in that moment, I understood that the river's song wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who had ever felt lost, weary, or alone. It was a reminder that healing is possible, even in the darkest of times. That peace can be found, even in the midst of turmoil. The song seemed to fade slowly, the notes drifting off like whispers in the wind. But as they vanished, I felt a warmth settle in my chest, a quiet joy that hadn't been there before. The river's song had done its work. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in days. The exhaustion that had once felt like a weight pressing down on me now felt distant, like a memory of something that no longer had power over me. I took one last look at the river, its surface now shimmering under the soft moonlight. The melody had stopped, but its presence lingered, like a secret that had been shared between us. One that would stay with me, guiding me, reminding me that healing was always within reach. As I made my way back home, the night no longer felt heavy. The path I had once walked in darkness now seemed illuminated, not by the moon, but by the quiet strength that had been born in that moment by the river. And I knew, deep in my heart, that whenever life became too much, whenever the weight of the world felt unbearable, I would always be able to return to the river. Its song would always be there, waiting to soothe my weary heart, offering the comfort and healing I needed. It's strange how something so simple, so natural, can have such a profound effect on us. The river's song wasn't magic, it was just the sound of nature, of life itself. But it had the power to heal in a way nothing else could. And sometimes that's all we really need. A reminder that no matter how lost or broken we feel, there is always a song, a melody of healing that can help guide us back to peace. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the echoes of the river's song lingered in my mind, soft and soothing, like a lullaby that would carry me through the days to come. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that everything would be okay. The river had healed me, and I would carry its melody with me wherever I went. The day had begun, as all the others had soft and quiet, with the sun still hiding behind the hills. But there was something different about this morning, something I couldn't quite explain. I had always been drawn to the river, but today it seemed to call me more than usual. Perhaps it was the way the mist hung in the air, curling like tendrils over the water, or maybe it was the way the first light of dawn bathed everything in a soft, golden glow. But as I stood there at the riverbank, I felt the weight of something unspoken, pressing in on me. I had been visiting the river for years. It was a place of comfort for me, a place where I could reflect, think, and escape the clamor of everyday life. But this morning felt different. As I stepped closer to the water, I noticed the fog swirling in thick layers above the surface, obscuring the world beyond. The mist was dense, almost alive, moving in waves as though it had its own rhythm, its own breath. I sat down on a smooth stone by the river's edge, my feet dangling just above the water. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the soft murmur of the river wash over me. The air was crisp, still carrying the remnants of the night's coolness, and I inhaled deeply, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. But then something shifted. Something in the air seemed to change, and I opened my eyes again. The river, normally clear and reflective, now appeared cloudy, the mist above it almost thickening, swirling as if it were hiding something beneath. As I stared into the water, a strange sensation crept up my spine, a sense that something was waiting, something was about to happen. And then, just as quickly, a figure emerged from the fog, so faint that I almost questioned if I had seen it at all. A shape human, yet not quite human, slowly formed in the mist, its edges blurred like a dream that had yet to fully take shape. I blinked, my breath caught in my chest, and I watched as the figure moved closer. It was a woman, her figure clothed in flowing white robes that fluttered around her, as though they were made of the very mist itself. Her face was soft, ethereal, almost as if she had never existed in the real world at all. I could hardly believe my eyes. Who was she? Where had she come from? The vision felt so real, yet so impossible, as though she belonged to another time altogether. My heart raced, a mixture of awe and fear curling in my chest. The woman's eyes locked with mine, and I felt an unexpected pull, like I was tethered to her by something deeper than mere curiosity. Without a word, the woman raised her hand, gesturing for me to follow. My feet moved without thinking, carrying me toward her. The fog thickened, the air grew colder, and I felt a chill run through my bones. But it was also a kind of warmth and unexplainable sense of comfort mixed with dread. As I followed her, the surroundings seemed to shift, becoming less familiar, as though the world around me was warping. The trees, once standing tall and sturdy, now appeared twisted and bent, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath my feet softened, as if the earth itself were shifting with every step. The river, too, began to change. The sound of its flow grew louder, more intense, as if it were carrying something ancient with it, something that had been waiting for centuries to be heard. The woman led me to the water's edge, where the mist was the thickest. She didn't speak, but her gaze seemed to tell me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just a figure of the present. No, she was something more. A memory, a whisper from the past. And then, as though sensing my thoughts, the woman stepped into the water, disappearing into the mist. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. A deep, unexplainable urge pulled at my chest, urging me to follow. But before I could move, the mist began to clear, and the scene around me shifted once more. I was no longer standing by the river, but instead I was somewhere else entirely. I could see it now, the past a vision, alive and vivid, stretched out before me. The woman was no longer in her ethereal form, but a real person, standing by the same river just as I had seen her. But this was another time, another place. The world was different then, a landscape filled with tall grasses and wildflowers, the sound of the river stronger and clearer than I had ever heard it. And in this past, the woman stood beside a man, her hand gently resting in his. Their eyes were locked in a silent promise, a love so powerful that it radiated between them, despite the distance of time. They stood there for a moment, gazing at each other with an intensity that made the world seem to fall away. It was as though nothing else mattered, as though they had found something that could never be broken. But then the vision shifted again, and the man began to walk away, his steps heavy, his head low in sorrow. The woman called after him, but he didn't turn back. The river, once a symbol of peace, now seemed to carry a mournful undertone, as though it had witnessed this moment for centuries. The weight of unspoken goodbyes hanging in the air, The vision of the woman's face twisted with heartbreak, and she reached out, as though trying to grasp onto something she could never hold again. I felt the pain of that moment seep into my soul, and I realized that this was the story of the river. It wasn't just a flow of water. It was a keeper of memories of grief, love, and loss. The river whispered its stories to those who would listen, sharing the fragments of lives long gone. The vision began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled back to the present. I stumbled, disoriented, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had witnessed. The river, still flowing in front of me, seemed to calm, the mist now dissipating like a dream, leaving only the quiet ripple of water in its wake. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I realized that the river had shown me something important. It wasn't just the water that carried the past, it was the river itself. A living memory, a keeper of the stories that never truly fade. It whispered to those who were willing to listen, offering glimpses into lives long gone, into moments that still held power. And as the sun slowly rose, casting its first golden light over the river's surface, I understood the river's whisper wasn't just about the past, it was about healing, about moving forward while still honoring the stories that shaped us. The past and present were forever intertwined, like the flow of the river itself, constant, eternal, and full of meaning. I sat there for a long time, watching the water, the world around me growing quieter with each passing moment. And though the vision had faded, its message remained clear. Sometimes, the past speaks to us, not in words, but in the soft whispers of the river's flow. There are some places in the world that seem to hold a quiet power, a kind of ancient energy that runs deeper than the surface, a force that hums quietly beneath the things we can see and touch. The river by my childhood home was one of those places. I had spent countless hours along its banks, listening to the water, watching the way the current would twist and pull, and feeling as though I could hear the whispers of something far older than myself. The river was beautiful, yes, but there was something more to it. Something that felt as though it held secrets that only those willing to truly listen could understand. I didn't always know what I was hearing, but there were moments, quiet moments, when the water seemed to speak to me, as if it was telling me something I needed to know. It wasn't a loud voice, not at all. It was a whisper, soft, gentle, but so clear, like a promise made long ago. I remember one particular evening, just before dusk, when the river's call was stronger than usual. I had been walking the worn path beside the water, feeling the cool breeze that carried with it the scent of wet earth and pine. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over the world, and everything felt still, as though time itself had slowed just for a moment. I had reached my favorite spot, where the river curved gently around a cluster of large rocks. It was a peaceful, place-protected, almost sacred. I often came here to sit, to think, to let the world drift away for a while. But that evening, as I sat on the smooth stone by the river's edge, I felt something different. The air had grown still, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the soft murmur of the water. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. But then it came again, the whisper, so faint but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to listen. The river had always whispered in its way, its murmur a constant presence. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like it was speaking directly to me, as if it had something it needed to share. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, listening intently. "Trust," the whisper seemed to say. It was gentle, like the touch of a hand on my shoulder, but also strong in its certainty. "Trust the flow. Trust the current. Let go." I shivered slightly, unsure if I had truly heard those words, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I sat there, the quiet murmur of the river became louder in my ears, as though the water itself was drawing me into a deeper understanding, one I wasn't sure I was ready for. There was a comfort in it, a promise that was both soothing and unsettling. I looked at the river's surface. The water shimmered under the fading light, and in the shifting ripples I thought I saw something. It wasn't a figure, not exactly, but it was as though the water itself was alive, swirling and moving with purpose. A quiet energy flowing through it, one that had existed long before I was born and would continue long after I was gone. The whisper came again, louder now, as if the river was speaking not just to me, but to the very core of my being. I have watched, I have listened. I have carried every secret and every sorrow. You are part of this. You are part of the flow. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still on the bank at all, or if the river had somehow pulled me into it, into its timeless current. I felt small in the face of it, but also connected, as though I had always been a part of this place. The river had seen everything, it seemed, and somehow, it knew exactly what I needed to hear. You are not alone, it whispered. I carry your burdens just as I carry all the others. Trust me. I closed my eyes then, feeling the weight of the river's words settle in my chest. It wasn't just the river speaking to MIT, was the earth itself, the trees, the wind. It was the world reminding me that no matter how heavy the moments were, there was always the promise of release, of letting go. The river was the keeper of everything, of joy and pain, of laughter and sorrow. It held the past, the present, and the future all at once, flowing eternally forward, always moving, never stagnant. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace fill me. The river's promise wasn't one of easy answers or quick fixes. It wasn't about the absence of hardship or the disappearance of pain. No, the promise was deeper than that. It was a vow, whispered quietly, that no matter what happened, the river would always be there. It would always carry you, even when you couldn't see the way ahead, even when the path was unclear. The river would be your constant, your reminder that you were not alone. And just as I was starting to stand up, to leave the river's edge, a soft breeze ruffled the leaves above me, and the whisper seemed to linger in the air, like the final notes of a song that had been played just for me. I turned one last time to look at the water, and in that fleeting moment, I knew something deep within my heart. The river's promise wasn't just a promise to me, it was a promise to everyone who truly listened, to everyone who was willing to surrender, just for a moment, to the flow. The river was always there, always waiting, always carrying us, no matter how far we drifted, always there to remind us that we too were a part of something greater. And as I walked away from the river, I felt lighter, as though the burden I had carried for so long had eased just a little. The promise had been made, and somehow I knew that I would be okay. All I had to do was trust the flow. With each step, the whisper faded, but the feeling remained, the river's vow, now woven into the fabric of my soul. I've always been drawn to the river that ran near my childhood home. It sung like a lullaby that would call me in moments of quiet, but there was something about that melody, something beneath the surface, that caught my attention more deeply as the years passed. It was subtle at first, a mere flicker of something I couldn't quite name. The deeper I ventured into the woods, following the winding path by the river, the clearer that tune became. And one day, in the soft, fading light of dusk, I decided to follow the melody to its source. It was a cool evening, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The river was flowing steady, its surface glistening faintly in the light of the setting sun. I had always walked along its banks, but this time felt different. The air was heavier, thick with something I couldn't explain. The usual peaceful rustling of leaves in the wind was replaced by a soft, low hum, like a song carried on the breeze, only it wasn't just the wind. It was the river itself, or at least that's what it seemed to be. I walked deeper into the woods than I ever had before. drawn to that distant, haunting melody. The path was narrower here, almost hidden, the trees growing thick and tangled, as if they were guarding something. But there was no turning back. Each step I took felt as though the forest itself was encouraging me to continue, the air growing cooler with each moment, as if the trees were alive, watching me, waiting. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The feeling was subtle, like a shadow just beyond my sight. I kept my eyes ahead, but every now and then I felt the air shift around me. The song, soft and faint, was still there, growing louder as I ventured deeper. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A small, overgrown pathway, nearly invisible among the brambles and moss-covered stones. It was almost as if it had been forgotten by time itself. I paused, the melody now clearer than ever, like it was calling me, urging me to follow the trail. I couldn't resist. Something inside me, a quiet pull, urged me forward. The pathway seemed to narrow further, leading me between thick tree trunks, the branches high above blocking out most of the light. My steps were soft on the forest floor, my breath the only sound in the quiet. But as I walked, I could feel the ground shift beneath my feet. The earth was uneven here, ancient perhaps, as though the trail had not been walked in centuries. The song was so clear now, and I couldn't help but follow its pull. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, soothing yet filled with a deep, sorrowful longing, a song of something lost to time. The path twisted and turned, leading me toward an area I didn't recognize, even though I had spent so much of my childhood walking the woods. I stopped, suddenly aware of how far I had strayed from the familiar. The trees were taller here, their trunks wider, and the air was dense with an almost otherworldly quiet. I felt the presence of something ancient, something watching. I could no longer hear the river, but the song remained, echoing in my mind. And then, through a clearing, I saw it, the source of the melody. A small, forgotten stone bridge, half swallowed by vines and moss. It was as though time had passed it by, leaving it untouched by man or weather. The song was emanating from beneath the bridge, the water that rushed beneath it, swirling with a rhythm of its own. It wasn't just the sound of water moving. It was as if the river itself was singing, the sound carrying the weight of centuries. The melody was soft, luring, almost mournful, as if it carried the grief of generations. I stood there for a moment, unable to move, transfixed by the beauty and the sorrow of the sound. But as I listened, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The song wasn't just a song, it was a call to anyone who would listen. I crouched down near the edge of the bridge, peering into the dark water below. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something shimmer beneath the surface, something pale, almost human in shape, its form shifting in the current, as if it was reaching up toward me. I blinked, and the vision was gone. The river now calm and still, the only sound the soft murmur of water moving over stones. My heart raced in my chest as I took a step back. I wasn't sure what I had just seen it at all, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The song, that haunting melody, was still in the air, but now it felt darker, as if it was no longer the river calling, but something else entirely. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen the strange figure. And then it came to me. The song wasn't just an echo of the past. It was a memory of those who had come before, of those who had lost their way, who had been swallowed by the forest. The melody was a warning, a reminder that there were things buried here, beneath the river's surface, things that time had forgotten, things that the earth had kept hidden for a reason. The air felt heavier now, the light dimming as the last of the sun slipped behind the trees. It was time to leave. I turned quickly, my feet carrying me back along the forgotten pathway. The song was fading, but the feeling lingered, an unsettling pull, a quiet warning that I could not ignore. I didn't look back, not once. I didn't tell anyone about the bridge or the song. There are some things, I suppose, that are best left undisturbed, hidden where they belong. But every time I walk near that river, when the wind is right, I can still hear the faintest echo of that melody, a sound that calls to me, a sound that reminds me that there are pathways in the world that are forgotten for a reason. And perhaps, just perhaps, some paths are better left unexplored. There's a river that winds its way through the land near my childhood home. In that moment, I realized that the river's secret was one of eternal continuity. It was a reminder that everything is connected, that time isn't linear, and that we are all part of something greater than ourselves. The river did not judge the moments it carried, the stories it held. It simply was flowing, ever moving, always present. I don't know how long I sat there, entranced by the river's secret, but when I finally rose to leave, the mist had dissipated, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the trees. The river was still calm, its surface reflecting the dawn's light like a mirror. But I felt different, lighter, somehow, as though I had glimpsed eternity and been touched by it. Since that day, I have returned to the river many times, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes in the dead of night. Each time, I hear its whispers. But now, when I listen, I understand its secret. The river is a keeper of time, a witness to everything that has come before and everything that will come after. It holds the memories of the world, the moments that make up the vast tapestry of life. And though I know I will never fully understand it, I am at peace with that. The river's promise, its eternal flow, is enough. Its secret is a reminder that we too are part of that flow, connected to everything that has ever been and everything that will be. The river has no beginning and no end. It simply is, and it will always be. And I, like so many others before me, will continue to listen. The sun had just begun to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the valley. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed still, the kind of stillness that wraps around you, making the world feel quiet and intimate. I stood by the edge of the river, gazing at the water as it shimmered beneath the fading light. The familiar rustle of the leaves above me and the gentle murmur of the river were comforting. There was always something soothing about the sound of flowing water, something ancient and peaceful. I had been coming to this spot for years, ever since I was a child. The river had always been a part of my life, a constant presence that I had never really questioned. But that evening, as I stood there, I felt something different. There was a weight to the air, a quiet heaviness that made my heart beat just a little faster. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the river wash over me. It wasn't long before I heard it, just a whisper at first, barely audible over the sound of the water. I leaned in, straining to hear. The river had always whispered, but tonight it seemed as though the whispers were clearer, more urgent. It wasn't just the river this time, I realized. It was something else, something that felt far older, far deeper. The whispers felt familiar, like a voice I had heard in a dream, or maybe a voice from my past. Slowly, as if it were waiting for me to listen, the sound grew louder. And then, in the quiet of the evening, I heard the words. "Come," the river seemed to say. "Come closer, child. There is something you must see." I hesitated. The feeling that something profound was unfolding made my skin tingle. But curiosity, that old familiar companion, drew me forward. I stepped closer to the river, my feet sinking into the soft earth with each step. The air grew colder, and the mist rising from the water swirled around me, almost as though it were beckoning me in. I felt as though I was being led somewhere, but I didn't know where. I reached the edge of the water, and as I knelt down, I felt the pull of something, not of this world, but something undeniably real. And then, just like that, the river spoke again, this time clearer than ever. "You must understand," it whispered. "There are times when the river holds a soul, guiding them toward peace. And tonight, it is your turn to listen." I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew this was no ordinary evening. The river had a story to tell, and I was meant to hear it. The mist around me thickened, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the water. It was faint, like a shadow, but there was something about it that seemed so real, so alive. The figure was a person, or at least it looked like one. Slowly, it began to move toward me, its steps as silent as the river itself. As the figure came closer, I felt my heart tighten in my chest. I knew this person. I had seen them before, though I couldn't remember where. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, I realized it was my grandmother. She had passed away many years ago, her departure leaving a hole in my heart that I thought would never heal. But here she was, standing in front of me, her eyes soft and knowing. She looked the same as I remembered, only now there was a sense of peace in her expression that I had never seen before. "Grandma," my voice came out in a whisper, not daring to disturb the quiet around us. The figure smiled, a gentle, loving smile that made my heart ache with longing. "You've come to say goodbye," she said, her voice like the wind rustling through the trees. "But it is not a goodbye, my dear. It is a farewell that must happen." The words hit me like a wave. I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted, and I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. My grandmother reached out her hand, and I, unable to resist, took it. Her touch was warm, real, and comforting, just as it had always been. "The river," she said softly, her gaze turning to the water that flowed peacefully beside us, "has a way of carrying souls when the time is right. It holds them for a while, and then it releases them, guiding them to peace. I've been waiting for my turn, just as many before me have." I looked at her, not quite understanding, but knowing instinctively that this was a moment of great significance. The river, I realized, wasn't just a body of water. It was a sacred place, a bridge between this world and the next. The whispers I had been hearing all these years had been more than just the river's song. They were the voices of those who had passed, being carried away on the current. "Your heart will heal, child," my grandmother continued, her voice soft, like the murmur of the river itself. "The pain you've carried, the grief you've felt, will pass. It is the way of life. The river helps us let go. It carries our memories, our sorrows, and guides us to peace." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of her words settled over me, and I realized she was right. I had been holding on to so much, so many regrets, so much sadness, and now, here was the river, offering me the chance to release it all. "I will never leave you," she whispered, her hand gently pulling away from mine as she began to fade. "I will always be with you in the whispers of the river. And when your time comes, you will hear my voice again, guiding you, just as the river guides me now." The figure of my grandmother vanished into the mist, her presence lingering in the air like a memory I would never forget. And as the mist dissipated, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me, as if the river had given me something I hadn't realized I needed. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't gone. The river still carried its stories, its promises, its guidance. It would always be there, a quiet, eternal companion, leading those who listened to the peace they sought. As I stood up to leave, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in twilight. I felt a calmness in my heart, a quiet joy that I hadn't felt in years. The river had given me its blessing, and with it, I knew that everything would be okay. The last farewell was never truly a goodbye. It was just another step in the journey, a journey that the river would continue to carry, guiding each soul to its peaceful resting place. And I too would one day follow. It was the kind of evening that seemed to stretch endlessly, where the sun melted into the horizon and the air felt thick with anticipation. I had returned to the village of my childhood, a place I hadn't visited in many years. It was a small, quiet settlement nestled by the river, surrounded by forests and fields, a place that, in my memory, had always felt like home, despite the years that had passed. I had come back, not for a reunion, but for something else, a pull that I couldn't explain, something that seemed to beckon me back to the heart of the village. The whispers I had heard all those years ago, the same whispers that had followed me to the river, were louder now. The river's call had brought me here, to this very spot, to this moment. The village had changed. There were more houses now, new faces, and a general air of unfamiliarity. Yet, when I walked through the streets, I could still hear the echoes of the past, feel the presence of those who had been here before me. The village was older than the memories of the people who now lived there. It had witnessed countless lives, countless stories, and perhaps countless sorrows. I made my way toward the center of the village, where the old stone bridge spanned the river. The bridge had always been a symbol of connection for the villagers. It was said that the river carried with it more than water. It carried stories, secrets, and, sometimes, old wounds that never quite healed. As I walked closer to the bridge, I saw the familiar faces of the village elders sitting by the riverbank, their expressions calm but distant. They had lived through the years of hardship, through the loss and pain that had gripped this village. I had heard whispers of those times when the village had been divided, torn apart by old grudges that seemed impossible to mend. I approached them cautiously, my heart heavy with the knowledge of the past. There was one elder in particular, a woman named Maeve, who had been the heart of the village, the one who had always kept the stories alive. She saw me approach and gave a faint, knowing smile. "You've come back," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of time. "I wondered when the river would call you home." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Maeve had always been the keeper of the village's stories. She had lived through the pain, through the separation, and yet she had always believed that the river could heal what was broken. And now I was here, standing at the river's edge, ready to witness whatever it was the river had in store for me. As the sun dipped lower, casting an orange glow over the river's surface, Maeve began to speak. Her voice was quiet but steady, as though she had waited a lifetime to tell this story. "Many years ago," she began, "there was a rift in this village, a disagreement that tore families apart. It was over something so small, yet it festered into something much larger. Brothers turned against brothers. Friends became strangers. The river witnessed it all, and the river, well, the river was silent." For a time she paused as if lost in the memory. The other elders around her nodded, their faces solemn. After the rift, the village became fractured. People moved away, and some never came back. Those who stayed carried the weight of those old wounds. But there was always one thing that remained constant: this river. The same river that carried your ancestors. The same river that carried all of us. Maeve's eyes grew distant as she spoke, as though seeing something beyond the present. I could almost feel the sorrow that had lingered in the air for so long. It was as if the village had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "The river," Maeve continued, her voice now carrying a strange reverence, "began to sing again after all those years of silence. Not long ago, a melody rose from its depths, soft at first, then louder, until it could no longer be ignored. It called to the people who were still here, those who had never left, and even to those who had gone away." I looked at her, confused. "A melody?" Maeve nodded. "Yes, child, a melody. The river's song. It was the river's way of calling us back, calling us to remember, calling us to heal." The air around us seemed to grow heavier, as though the river itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the water wash over me. And then, Just as Maeve had described, I heard it, a faint, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the very depths of the river. It wasn't a song in the traditional sense. It was more like the river was speaking in a language older than words, a language that only those who truly listened could understand. The melody swirled around me, gentle at first, then stronger, as though it were calling to something deep inside of me. And then I knew the river wasn't just calling me back. It was calling the village back, calling us to heal the old wounds, to reconcile the past. I turned to Maeve, my heart pounding in my chest. It's the river, isn't it? It's the river that's been guiding us all along. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. Yes, child, the river. It has always been the keeper of our memories, our sorrows, and our hopes. It has seen the divisions, but it has also seen the healing. The river's melody, ... It brings closure. As the melody continued to play, I could see it happening. One by one, the villagers began to gather, drawn by the sound, by the pull of the river's song. They came quietly, without words, as though the river itself had reached into their hearts and reminded them of what they had lost. And then, something beautiful began to unfold. Families who had been separated for years, whose names had become bitter on each other's tongues, began to speak again. The past that had been buried in silence for so long began to surface, not as a source of anger, but as a bridge to understanding. Old friends embraced, their eyes filled with tears, their voices shaking with emotions long held back. Those who had once sworn never to speak to each other again now stood together by the river, their hearts open to the possibility of healing. I watched in awe as the village began to reunite. It was as if the river had breathed life into something that had seemed impossible. The melody, soft yet powerful, carried through the village, weaving its way into every soul. It was a promise, the river's promise, that no wound was too deep to heal, no distance too far to cross. As the night deepened and the last traces of the sunset faded into the sky, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. The river's whispers had brought us together, had mended what was broken. The village had been reunited, not by force or by will, but by something far more profound, the river's song, its gift of closure. And as I stood there, listening to the river's melody, I knew that I, too, had been part of something timeless, something that would echo through the generations. The river had whispered its truth, and the village had listened. It was a truth that would stay with me always, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could be healed when we allowed the melody of forgiveness to guide us. I had heard of the river's whispers long before I ever returned to the village. Growing up, I had often heard stories of the river that flowed silently through the land, carrying with it tales of lost loves, forgotten dreams, and the untold history of the village. As a child, I always found the stories comforting, a sort of lullaby that soothed my restless thoughts before sleep. But there was something more to those whispers, something I never fully understood until I came back. After years of living in the city, I found myself standing at the edge of the river once again, my heart heavy with the weight of memories. It was early morning, just as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The village, as quiet as it always was, seemed still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The river had always been more than a stream of water. It was a living thing, pulsing with energy, with history, and most importantly, its song. They used to say that if you listened closely, you could hear the melody it carried, a song that was passed down from generation to generation, a song that held the power to change lives. I had grown up hearing it, though I never truly understood its meaning. But now, as I stood there, the sound of the river's whisper seemed to take on a new weight. It was clearer, more present, as if the song was calling to me, asking me to listen with new ears. As I walked closer to the water's edge, I saw that I wasn't the only one drawn to its sound. A few villagers had gathered there, their faces solemn but full of reverence. They too had heard the whispers, each of them affected in ways they hadn't expected. Maeve, the elder of the village, stood at the front, her eyes closed, her face lifted towards the sky. Her hands were clasped in front of her, as if she were waiting for something. I approached her cautiously, my heart pounding. There was something in her presence that made the air feel thicker, as if we were standing on the precipice of something momentous. "It calls to us, doesn't it?" I asked softly, not wanting to disturb the quiet reverence of the moment. Maeve opened her eyes slowly, her gaze steady and knowing. "Yes, child, it has always called to us, but now it is clearer than ever. The river's song is not just a melody, it is a promise, a legacy, and it has the power to change us if we let it." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The weight of her words settled heavily in my chest. The song of the river had always been part of the village, but now it seemed to have taken on a new purpose, a new meaning. It was as if the whispers had become a force, a living thing, ready to shape the future of the people who had lived in its shadow for so long. As the first notes of the river's song echoed through the air, something stirred inside me. It was a sound I had known all my life, but now it felt different, more urgent, more alive. The villagers around me seemed to sense it too. One by one, they closed their eyes, allowing the melody to wash over them. I could feel the tension in the air in anticipation, awaiting, and then, as if on cue, something shifted. The whispers became clearer, rising above the gentle lapping of the water, rising into something more, a chorus, a collective voice that seemed to speak directly to the hearts of the listeners. I stood there, stunned, as I began to hear the song in a way I had never heard it before. It wasn't just a melody, it was a story that wove itself through the past, present, and future of the village. It spoke of old wounds, of forgotten promises, and of the healing that could come if only the villagers would listen, truly listen. And then, as the song unfolded, I understood. The river's song wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, and what we could become if we embraced the truth it offered. Maeve, who had been standing silently through it all, turned to face the villagers. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a lifetime. "The song has always been with us. It is the thread that ties us together, the legacy of our people, of our ancestors, and of this river. It reminds us of who we are and what we are capable of." Her words seemed to sink deep into the hearts of those who listened, and I saw the change in them. It whispered of the years it had watched over the village, the generations of people who had relied on it, loved it, feared it, and ultimately had to say goodbye. I closed my eyes, listening to the fading song of the river, and in that moment I understood. The river had always been a part of us, and we a part of it, but even the river, no matter how powerful or eternal it seemed, had its limits. The time had come for it to rest, for its song to fade into silence. But there was something beautiful in that. The river wasn't dying, it was simply transforming. It was letting go of its old life, its old rhythm, and finding a new peace in the stillness. It had carried the weight of the world for so long, but now it was time to rest, to close its eyes and sleep. The final notes of the river's song echoed softly in the air, like a fading memory, like the last breath of something precious. It was almost as if the river itself was trying to tell me something that I couldn't quite grasp, but I could feel deep within my heart. Maybe it was a lesson in letting go. Maybe it was a reminder that even the most enduring things in life need rest, that every journey has its end, and that the end is not something to fear. The river's whisper grew softer and softer until, finally, it was no more. The water was still, the air quiet. I sat there, motionless, feeling the weight of the silence settling over me. There was no panic, no fear, just an overwhelming sense of peace. I stayed by the river until the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, casting a soft glow over the landscape, The mist had begun to lift, and the world felt different somehow, lighter, more peaceful. The village had yet to stir, but I knew that when they woke, they would feel it too. The river's song had faded, but it would never truly be gone. Its legacy would live on in the hearts of those who had listened, in the stories passed down through the years. As I rose to leave, I placed my hand on the water one last time, feeling the coolness of the stream, now so much slower than before. The river had given me everything it could, and now it was time for it to rest, to sleep. But in its silence, I knew the song would continue quietly, peacefully, in the depths of the earth, in the hearts of those who had loved it, and in the memory of all the lives it had touched. The river sleeps now, its whispers fading into the stillness, but its legacy is forever woven into the fabric of the village. And as I walked away, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that sometimes the most powerful moments come in the quietest of silences.